Hey, what's up? It's 𝘰𝘆𝘴𝘵𝘢𝘐𝑇. This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku reunited with his first love after the war. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Prologue. The Strange Englishman. The small western town of Mighty River took its name from a true hero, a man brave enough to stand against an immortal being to save those he loved. The tale of Toshinori Yagi and his stand against the devil was short and direct, but it did not spare the details of how heroic Toshinori had been. Legend held that on a cold night in the middle of the desert, Toshinori set up camp along a wide river with his new wife and friends. While they were making camp, a man in a peculiar English suit appeared. The elders of Mighty River would later say he spoke with a strong English accent and possessed an oddly foreign attractiveness. No one in those parts had seen a man like him before. He had not ridden in on horseback. He had simply appeared, which was uncanny given the nearest settlement was 3 days away. He threatened the campers with wild proclamations about souls and punishment in hell, and one startled camper asked if he was ill. The stranger laughed and then proclaimed that he was the devil, Lucifer, the fallen angel from their Bible, and that they would obey him. No one truly believed the claim at first. He was eccentric and unnerving, but that alone did not make him a supernatural being. He proved his power with a single dreadful demonstration. With an inhuman gesture, he unleashed a burst of dark energy that set a wagon and 2 horses on fire, leaving the camp reeling. After that display of might, he issued another dire threat, and Toshinori stepped forward. Toshinori proposed a challenge. He told the stranger that if he lost he would let them be killed, but if he won they would be allowed to stay and build their settlement. The stranger accepted and they fought. Toshinori gave everything he had, while the man who claimed to be the devil seemed barely tested. Toshinori came away bruised and bearing a visible wound to his lip. The stranger showed no apparent injury. When the wound on Toshinori's lip became apparent, the elders said the devil was taken aback by Toshinori's strength and spirit. In the end the stranger relented. The camp could remain and build their town, but they would carry a debt. In 50 years they would pay for having built on land the stranger claimed. To him, building on stolen ground was a crime worthy of a future reckoning. Chapter 1. Izuku Midoriya. 39 years later, the town of Mighty River had grown from a handful of families into a bustling cowtown with over 400 permanent residents. Situated along the Yue River, the town had become known for producing hardy cattle that drew traders from the west and north. The success of their herds put Mighty River on the map. Travelers and traders came and went every day. A carriage rolled toward the town as a little girl watched the passing pastures. Yin asked her mother why there were so many cows. Her father answered that it was because they had come to a cowtown and that she would see many cows from now on. Yin thought she did not like cows. She watched a group grazing on short, brown grass behind a fence and wrinkled her nose at the unfamiliar smell. She then asked how her father would manage his railroad work from such a remote place. Her father reassured her that he would sort it out. The man in charge of railroad construction in the east told her she would not need to worry. Yin only hummed in uncertain agreement. They had moved often for her father's work, never staying in one home for more than a few months, but never before had they moved to a cowtown. After 20 minutes of herds and ranches, Mighty River came into view. The town was large enough for a couple of hundred people, with a peculiar corner building that served as both hotel and saloon. To one side was a barber and to the other a gun shop, a general store and a hitching lean-to clustered nearby. More buildings lined the dirt road, and people in rough clothing moved about, many on horseback and giving the impression of having traveled hard and slept little. Instead of turning left or right at the corner, the driver kept the horses going straight down the main lane toward the heart of town. The driver parked the big wooden box in front of the hotel. Yin's father did not wait for him to open the door and sprang down from the carriage, enthusiastic as ever. He offered his hand to his wife to help her descend. Without the help of either parent, Yin jumped down and onto the ground. Her father welcomed them to their new home. Yin had expected a nice house on the outskirts of town. That was how she had lived for the last 9 years, so why would it change now? For 9 years her father had overseen construction of the railroad. Every 5 or 6 months she packed her things, said goodbye to any friends she had made, and moved on. While the locations and faces changed, the pattern did not. They always lived in a charming 2-story house on the outskirts of whatever town they were in. Every house was different, but always spacious. This time was different, and 𝑦𝑐𝐸 did not like different. It was hard to feel in control when life was uprooted every few months. If she had to move so often, at least she wanted a house to come back to, no matter how big or small. Instead, the family would be staying in the hotel, in a cramped suite with 2 beds and its own bathroom, a rare luxury in a small cowtown. There was barely enough room to breathe. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 gasped as she entered the room and looked around in disbelief. Her father explained that they would be staying in the suite for the meantime, at least until their house was built. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 turned to glare at him and demanded to know what he meant. Her mother sighed, moved past her husband and daughter, and set her things on one of the beds. She removed her gloves, hat, and tall boots with quiet efficiency. Her father knelt to be eye level with the 10-year-old and said they planned to stay here a lot longer than 6 months. He said her mother did not want her spending her whole life on the move and that they had decided to plant roots here. He asked if she would like that. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 blinked. She had never imagined a life that did not involve constant travel with her father. She had always assumed she would move from town to town until she was married off like her mother. She realized she could not picture any other life. She admitted she did not know, shrugging and tearing her eyes away from her father. He cupped her cheek and smiled, then told her to go look around and not to get into any trouble. Her mother gave a reassuring nod, and 𝑦𝑐𝐸 pushed past her father. The door slammed behind her, and there was no going back. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 swallowed a ball of nervousness and walked slowly down the long hallway, following the sound of rowdy customers and music until she reached the staircase. From there she could see everything. The saloon was bustling, which did not surprise her. At 10 she had already seen many saloons. A crowd filled the room below, with older men drinking and laughing with companions on their arms. She padded down the stairs, keeping her eyes lowered and her hands to herself as she worked through the crowd. Once outside she drew a deep breath of fresh air and took in the town. People filled the streets. Women in corseted dresses and bold makeup stood and talked, others in worn dresses wandered with children and baskets of food, and riders on horseback arrived or left. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 was about to head toward the weapon shop when she noticed a little boy with wildly green hair running past, crying. Curious despite herself, she lifted the skirt of her dress and followed. She lost him in the crowd for a moment but found him a short distance away, sitting in an alley between a dress shop and a bank with his back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest and his head buried in his arms. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 cleared her throat and asked if he was okay, unsure whether she should have followed him. The boy looked up, and she flinched at the sight of his large, glossy green eyes rimmed in red and tears that his cheeks. A smear from his runny nose made him look small and overwhelmed. He wiped at his face with freckled hands, blinked, and smiled up at her. He told her he was fine and that she did not need to worry. Then he introduced himself as 𝐼𝐶𝐸 Midoriya and offered his hand. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 hesitated and stared at his hand with a mix of surprise and discomfort. The thought of shaking his hand after seeing him use it to wipe his nose made 𝑦𝑐𝐸 feel sick. The clear disgust on her face made 𝐼𝐶𝐸's eyes leak, this time harder. 𝐼𝐶𝐸 blubbered that she did not want to be his friend, then pulling his hand back, he said it was okay and that he would just be lonely forever as he cried. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 stared at the boy as if he had grown 2 heads and looked around for witnesses, but it was just the 2 of them. Reluctantly, she set her hand on his head and patted it, telling him not to fret and that she would be his friend. 𝐼𝐶𝐸 looked up at her with wide, shiny eyes and sniffled that he could not believe it. He blinked away his tears and, awkwardly, wiped his nose with his hand again. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 tried not to GG but nodded and affirmed the friendship. 𝐼𝐶𝐸 gasped and flung himself toward 𝑦𝑐𝐸, throwing his arms around her in a grateful hug and repeating his thanks. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 gently disentangled him and smoothed her dress. 𝐼𝐶𝐸 then asked her name. 𝑦𝑐𝐸 cleared her throat, straightened, and told him she was 𝑦𝑛𝐿. 𝐼𝐶𝐸, who knew little of the world beyond Mighty River, felt from the way she spoke that she was someone important and deserving of respect. He murmured that it was amazing. 𝐼𝐶𝐸 offered to show her around and mentioned he knew some pleasant places she might like. 𝑌𝑁 shrugged and agreed. She had nothing better to do. Chapter 2 Bullies. Izuku pointed out the sheriff's office, a two-story wooden building with a lean-to, and announced that the sheriff was Toshinori Yagi, saying he had rescued Izuku's grandfather from a demon when Mighty River was young. 𝑌𝑁 blinked at the mention of a demon and scoffed that it sounded impossible. Izuku insisted it was true and urged her to ask Toshinori himself just as the thin man exited the building. 𝑌𝑁 looked Toshinori over. He was gaunt and wore a golden star pinned to his vest. She approached him bluntly and challenged the story, saying the demon could not have existed here. Toshinori chuckled, lowered himself into a rocking chair, propped his feet on a small stool, and assured her with a toothy grin that it was true. Before the conversation could go further, a slightly larger boy shoved Izuku to the side. The boy warned Izuku to watch it, his tone hostile. 𝑌𝑁 bristled. She was no stranger to bullies and refused to let someone speak to her friend that way. Izuku tugged at 𝑌𝑁's hand and whispered for her to stop, his voice small and frightened. 𝑌𝑁 stepped forward and declared that she would not let someone disrespect her friend. The blond boy, Katsuki, and his two companions paused and demanded what she had said. 𝑌𝑁 repeated herself, standing tall and refusing to back down. A tense silence stretched through the street until Toshinori eased out of his chair and intervened, telling Katsuki to take it easy. 𝑌𝑁 flinched at the sound of the sheriff's joints creaking. Katsuki scowled but froze when Toshinori placed a bony hand on his head and ruffled his hair, advising him not to bully others and reminding 𝑌𝑁 that certain words were not suitable for a young lady. 𝑌𝑁 nodded. Toshinori then escorted Katsuki away, and the boy left with his posse, grumbling as they rounded a corner. The townspeople breathed easier. Izuku looked up at the sheriff with admiration and thanked him profusely. Toshinori smiled and said it was nothing, his gaze drifting to 𝑌𝑁, who was fidgeting with the lace on her sleeves. 𝑌𝑁 asked Izuku why he allowed himself to be treated that way. Izuku, startled, stammered that he did not mean to. Katsuki was simply bigger and intimidating. 𝑌𝑁 rolled her eyes. Unbelievable. 𝑌𝑁 turned on her heel and walked away in the direction Katsuki had just stomped off in. She wondered if it made sense that Izuku let him walk all over him simply because Katsuki was bigger. Later at dinner, while her parents discussed plans for their new house and the future of the town after the railroad was built, 𝑌𝑁 sat in silence. She thought about what Izuku had said about Katsuki and how utterly ridiculous it sounded. The idea that Izuku accepted poor treatment because he was smaller made her feel sick. Over the last 9 years, 𝑌𝑁 had watched many men mock her father for his unusual ideas, but even when they were bigger and more muscular, he never let them push him around. He might be tall and thin while others in the railroad business were broader, but he always stood up for himself and his work. Izuku was not successful like her father, but that did not mean he deserved to endure Katsuki's treatment. Her parents must have noticed the change because their conversation slowed. Her father asked what was wrong, and her mother remarked that 𝑌𝑁 had not touched her food. 𝑌𝑁 sighed and slouched back into her seat despite her mother's look. She asked her father in a small voice whether he had met bullies before. Her father's eyebrows lifted at the word. Bullies were a familiar topic at their table. There were bullies everywhere, and 𝑌𝑁 herself often suffered because she had advantages others did not. Both parents exchanged a concerned look. They had only been in Mighty River a short while, and already their daughter was asking about being bullied. Her father cleared his throat and explained that bullies were common in the railroad industry. Her mother set her glass down and asked why 𝑌𝑁 was asking, whether she was being bullied. 𝑌𝑁 looked up at her mother as if the question were absurd and explained that her new friend Izuku was being bullied by a kid named Katsuki, and Izuku let it happen because Katsuki was bigger. Her father listened, remembering his own younger years when he had been smaller and a target for teasing. He understood how intimidating it could be to be smaller than others and how easier it sometimes seemed to endure mistreatment rather than fight back. When her father was quiet, 𝑌𝑁 asked if there was anything she could do to help. Her mother suggested that 𝑌𝑁 could be there for Izuku. Friendship alone would not stop the bullying, but it could make him stronger. Her father took a sip of wine and smiled at the memory of their own childhoods. 𝑌𝑁 nodded firmly and declared that she would be Izuku's best friend and help make him stronger. Her parents relaxed and smiled with pride. Chapter 3. They're back and they're alive. 8 years later, 𝐻𝑗 stepped across the threshold into the quiet house she had once called home and paused with a shaky breath. She closed the front door, leaned back against it, and ran a hand through her messy hair. She shut her eyes and breathed for a moment. It had been an extraordinarily long Thursday. For reasons she could not pinpoint, the day had felt 10 times longer than usual. Each minute dragged, and the children had been more demanding than normal. 𝐻𝑗 was one of Mighty River's only teachers. There were 2 teachers in total, 𝐻𝑗, who taught children between 5 and 11, and an older teacher named Shota Aizawa, who handled the older students. Her class of young children did not fully understand boundaries yet, and much of the day had been spent answering questions about difficult topics and her personal life. 𝐻𝑗 was not sure anyone had learned anything valuable. She opened her eyes after a moment and blinked rapidly until her vision cleared. She looked around for her mother. For 2 years 𝐻𝑗 and her mother had lived alone in the house her father had built, but despite the small house, her mother still managed to avoid her most of the time. The past 2 years had been hard on her mother. 𝐻𝑗 understood that if her husband had been sent to war, she might have retreated from the world too. When she did not see or hear her mother, 𝐻𝑗 assumed she was asleep. She bent to remove her boots and set them aside, then hung her coat beside her father's. She moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Since she had shopped the day before, the cupboards were stocked. She chose something simple, chicken noodle soup with biscuits. While chopping celery, she heard footsteps on the stairs and did not bother to turn. She knew it was her mother. Her mother appeared, voice low and husky as if she had just woken, and asked what 𝐻𝑗 was making. 𝐻𝑗 said she was making chicken noodle soup. Her mother offered to help. 𝐻𝑗 placed the cut celery into the pot and then turned to face her mother, crossing her arms and taking in her disheveled appearance. Still in night clothes, hair in curlers, face flushed. 𝐻𝑗 declined the offer and told her mother to take care of herself. Her mother hesitated and then stepped closer, still unsettled by the day. A brief, ordinary moment passed as they settled into the evening routine. Her mother yawned and said she would be back soon. She turned and climbed the stairs, leaving 𝐻𝑗 to cook alone. Once everything was chopped and in the pot, 𝐻𝑗 grabbed a nearby basket and stepped out the back door. All of the chickens on the porch scattered as she moved, their clucking alerting the rooster. 𝐻𝑗 kept her eyes on the big red rooster as it strutted toward the porch, ready to fend off intruders. She hopped down the porch steps with the basket in hand and made her way to the chicken house. The hens scattered noisily when she opened the hatch, and 𝐻𝑗 checked the boxes, counting 6 eggs in each, 30 in total. She carefully gathered each egg and set them in the basket, then took another look around the yard before closing the hatch. The hens had stayed in their boxes today. Back inside, she set the basket on the counter and locked the back door. The kitchen did not smell like chicken noodle soup yet, so she set to putting the eggs away. While she was placing an egg into the metal tray, a rapid knocking came from the front door and a voice called up from the stairs, asking if she could get the door. 𝐻𝑗 paused, wondering who else would answer. She brushed her hands on her skirt and moved toward the front. The knocking grew louder and someone outside called her name urgently. Ochako was shouting for 𝐻𝑗 to open the door. 𝐻𝑗 muttered that she was coming and pulled the door open. Ochako leaned against the door frame, out of breath and grinning. Before Ochako could speak further, a distant train whistle cut through the air. 𝐻𝑗's eyes widened and she whispered that it couldn't be. Ochako urged her to put on her shoes quickly because they were back. 𝐻𝑗 bent to slip on her boots and reached for her coat. She glanced up the stairs at the open bathroom door and the strong scent of lavender, then called up that they were back and that her father had returned. Her mother gasped and water splashed in the background as she replied in surprise. 𝐻𝑗 added that she was going down to the station and asked her mother to watch the soup, then slipped out the front door and closed it behind her. Ochako grabbed 𝐻𝑗's hand and pulled her down the lane. Together they ran through town toward the station, leaving footprints and a cloud of dust. Other women rushed in the same direction. None of them held back. The men had finally returned from the war. The station platform was packed with women, children, and elders, all leaning forward with their heads turned in the same direction, waiting for the train. 𝐻𝑗 and Ochako, and a few friends waited a little behind the crowd, anxious but trying not to crowd the edge. Mina murmured that she could not believe they were back. Momo added with a small nod that she had not thought they would ever return. Ochako glanced at 𝐻𝑖𝐿, curious for her opinion, but 𝐻𝑖𝐿 was watching the approaching train, eager to see who had come home. Mina asked who they thought had made it back. Momo suggested that Katsuki would definitely return, earning agreement from the others, and added that 𝐼𝐸𝑬𝑄 and 𝘰𝑣𝘴𝑗𝑐𝑇 must have survived as well. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 said she thought 𝐰𝑖𝑧𝑢 had made it back, and when Momo and Mina reacted with surprise, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 explained that 𝐰𝑧𝑢 had more willpower than anyone she had ever met and would not give up. Momo laughed and reminded them of the time Katsuki had challenged 𝐰𝑧𝑢 over the mare Cassidy. Ochako gasped at the memory of 𝐰𝑧𝑢 walking away with a broken wrist but still managing to tame the mare. Mina recalled how angry Katsuki had been afterward. The train pulled into the station. Men leaned out of the windows, shouting and waving, and the crowd surged toward the doors. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 scanned the faces as soldiers stepped off, searching for her father, 𝐰𝑧𝑢, Katsuki, and 𝐼𝐸𝑬𝑄. Tears pricked her eyes when she did not see them. At the far end of the platform, 𝘰𝑣𝘴𝑗𝑐𝑇 disembarked, and Momo called out his name while waving. Everyone turned to watch. Momo did not wait for him to reach the group. She ran forward and gave 𝘰𝑣𝘴 a joyful hug, fingers threading through his hair in relief at seeing him safe. The embrace was warm and emotional, a simple, heartfelt reunion. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 pulled her gaze away from that scene to continue searching the crowd for her own loved ones. The crowd began to thin as most people reunited with their loved ones, leaving behind those who still held out hope. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 could hardly believe her eyes when two large, burly men stepped off the train. One was blonde and the other had short black hair. Katsuki Bakugou and 𝐼𝐸𝑬𝑄 Kirishima had returned. Mina expressed pure disbelief at their appearance. Ochako gasped at how big they had become. 2 years could change a person, especially in the army. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 had expected differences, but she had not expected them to look like giants. Before they left, both Katsuki and 𝐼𝐸𝑬𝑄 had worked on nearby ranches and had always been in good shape. Now they stood even taller and broader. They were both around 6'4", with 𝐼𝐸𝑬𝑄 just a touch taller. Their hair was cropped short, and faint scars marked their faces. Their jeans looked snug around the thighs, and both men wore heavy boots. Katsuki had an unbuttoned flannel that revealed his muscular torso, while 𝐼𝐸𝑬𝑄 wore a neat white button-up tucked into his pants. When they reached the group, Mina and Ochako pulled them into large, clumsy hugs. It was difficult to wrap their arms around such big men, but they managed. Up close, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 saw how massive they truly were, their hands dwarfing her own. 𝐼𝐸𝑬𝑄 looked down at 𝐻𝑖𝐿 over Mina's shoulder and opened one arm so she could join the embrace. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 stepped into his chest and wrapped her arms around his waist. She clutched the fabric of his shirt and buried her face against him. She had not realized until this moment how much she had missed Kirishima. The warmth of his presence brought a rush of relief. Although she still harbored resentment toward Katsuki for how he had treated 𝐰𝑧𝑢 in their youth, she offered him a small, genuine smile. She told herself it was out of courtesy, but deep down she was grateful he had come home. After a while, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 pulled away to search for 𝐰𝑧𝑢 and her father. The train was nearly empty. One last person stepped off, and it was 𝐰𝑧𝑢 Midoriya, supported by crutches and aided by another soldier. As the train began to pull away, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 recognized that her father had not returned. She fought to keep from dwelling on how he might have died and focused instead on the fact that her friends were alive and back. 𝐰𝑧𝑢 greeted her with a husky chuckle when they were close. A shaky smile crept onto 𝐻𝑖𝐿's face at the sight of him. Tears streamed down her cheeks. He opened his arms to her, and she threw herself into his embrace with a rush of sobs. She gripped his denim jacket in both hands and pressed her face to his chest. 𝐰𝑧𝑢 set his crutches aside with carefulness so he could hold her properly, and his own tears fell as he held her. 𝐰𝑧𝑢 had not expected to make it home from the war. He had feared he would die and that his loved ones would be told of his death. Surviving felt like an answered prayer, and he was grateful to be back with 𝐻𝑖𝐿. He pressed a brief, comforting kiss to the side of her head and reassured her that he was there now and she did not need to worry. The walk back to 𝐻𝑖𝐿's house took longer than she had anticipated because of 𝐰𝑧𝑢's crutches. They moved mostly in silence, content to simply be near one another again. 𝐻𝑛's mother stood on the porch, looking more put together than she had in a long time. Her hair was done, she wore a dress, and she even had on makeup. The sight of her so composed sent new tears down 𝐻𝑛's face. Izuku tightened his hold as he felt her quiet sobs. 𝐻𝑛's mother glanced between them and then looked behind them, searching for her husband. When she did not see him, she collapsed to the ground and let out a wail that carried through the yard. 𝐻𝑛 rushed to her mother and sat beside her, pulling her into a close embrace so they could grieve together. They mourned the loss of a father and husband who would not be replaced. Izuku watched from the driveway, his own face wet with tears. Mr. L.N. had been a father figure to him when he needed one most, someone kind and admired. The man's loss weighed heavily on Izuku. 𝐻𝑛 eventually helped her mother inside and took a moment to settle her in the parlor before returning to Izuku. It was not that he was completely unable to use his legs, but it took twice as much energy for him to go anywhere without help. Teary-eyed, 𝐻𝑛 guided Izuku across the driveway and into the house. Once they crossed the threshold, 𝐻𝑛 helped remove his boots and set his crutches by the door. She left Izuku in the parlor with her mother and went to the kitchen to prepare dinner, welcoming the distraction. She arranged 3 full bowls on a tray alongside a plate of homemade biscuits and made sure there were enough napkins and spoons. With a deep breath, she carried the tray into the living room. Normally she would not have thought to eat in the parlor, but none of them felt like moving much. She would make an exception for tonight. 𝐻𝑛 set down each bowl with a napkin and a spoon, placing the biscuits on the coffee table. Izuku murmured his thanks from his place in her father's armchair. 𝐻𝑛 nodded and offered a small, soft answer before sitting down herself. They ate in silence, punctuated only by the occasional sniffle. When the clinking of spoons against china stopped, 𝐻𝑛 stood to take the dirty dishes to the kitchen and asked if anyone wanted seconds, her voice low and hoarse from recent crying. Izuku asked if he could have another bowl, and 𝐻𝑛 agreed. The rest of the evening passed with very little conversation. After dinner, 𝐻𝑛's mother went upstairs to bed, leaving 𝐻𝑛 to the dishes and household chores. She washed the dishes, locked up the chickens, and tidied the parlor before helping Izuku to bed. He would stay in the downstairs guest bedroom until he was well enough to return to his own place. A few hours later, 𝐻𝑛 lay in her own bed, tucked beneath the covers, but sleep would not come. Thoughts of her father crowded her mind. How did he die? When did he die? Was the enemy involved? Question after question prevented her from finding peace. Why had he not written? He had been gone 2 years. Surely he had known how devastated her mother was. There had not been a single letter. 𝐻𝑛 looked toward her desk where a stack of unsent letters rested in the corner. After a year of sending messages and receiving nothing, she had stopped sending them, but she had not stopped writing. Every night she wrote to her father, chronicling each day. Some letters were 3 pages, others less than 1. There were at least 365 letters she had prepared, and yet he would never read them. Her eyes filled. The more she thought about the letters and her father, the more painful the realization became. He would not see her grow up, would not meet her future partner, would not see her walk down the aisle or meet his grandchildren. Overwhelmed, she cried into her pillow until exhaustion finally claimed her, her pillow damp with tears and her face swollen from sobbing. Chapter 5, Darlin. The following morning, Izuku woke to the smell of eggs and bacon cooking. The scent felt welcome after 2 long years of only the harsh smells of battle and grime. He took his time getting out of bed, telling himself there was no rush and the food would be there when he arrived. A few minutes later he hobbled out of his room, dressed and ready to face the day. 𝐻𝑛 greeted him warmly and asked how he had slept. Izuku's cheeks flushed as he thought of the dream-filled sleep he had enjoyed for the first time in a long time. He thanked her and said he had slept well. 𝐻𝑛 said she was glad he was home and offered him breakfast. She turned to plate food and then asked if he wanted anything to drink. Izuku requested orange juice, and 𝐻𝑛 poured a glass from a tall bottle, setting it beside his plate. 𝐻𝑛 mentioned that she needed to be at the school for a few hours and explained that there was leftover soup in the cellar and homemade blueberry pie on the counter. She suggested that if Izuku wanted to keep busy, he could tend the garden or fix the chicken coop, which needed attention. She admitted there were likely other small tasks he could do as well. Izuku looked at YN with admiration and told her she was amazing. YN humbly dismissed the praise and thanked him. She asked if he needed anything else before she left for the school. Izuku said he would be all right and thanked her again for everything. YN stepped closer and wrapped him in a comforting hug, telling him she was just glad he was safe. She asked him, earnestly, to promise he would not leave like that again. Izuku hesitated. He knew he could not truly promise such a thing, but for the sake of their shared peace, he agreed and promised he would not leave her in that way again, and he emphasized that she was his best friend. He felt his heart tighten as he said it, aware that calling her only his best friend comforted them both for the moment, nothing more and nothing less. While he may have felt something for the girl, there was a very low chance that she felt the same way. YN leaned up and kissed Izuku's cheek, then bounded up the stairs to get ready for work. A little less than 15 minutes later, she descended the steps. Izuku glanced over his shoulder and watched her, thinking she looked as stunning as ever. He had been doing the dishes before he saw her, so he set the dirty plates back down in the sink and turned to face her. Izuku chuckled and told her she looked gorgeous, folding his arms over his chest and letting his eyes take in the outline of her outfit. YN wore a long green skirt patterned with small white daisies and a plain white blouse tucked into the waistband. It was simple, but she carried it well. YN looked down at her outfit and giggled, accepting the compliment. She thanked Izuku and asked if he had been doing the dishes. He nodded eagerly and explained that he did not want her to come home to a sink full of dishes. YN pouted at his kindness and called him sweet. Izuku watched her sit on the bench by the door to slip on a pair of boots, the same pair she had worn the previous night. She was tying the left one when someone knocked at the door. YN called for a second and finished tying her boot, dusted her blouse, and rose to open the door. Standing beyond the screen was Katsuki Bakugou, a man YN had hoped would never come to her doorstep. Izuku's eyes widened at the sight of the blonde. He swallowed and began to move toward the front door, nervous. YN asked Katsuki what he was doing there, shocked. Katsuki leaned against the doorframe and said good morning, adding that he had hoped to walk her to work and asking if she worked at the school. YN looked to Izuku for help, at a loss for words. Katsuki then spoke loudly and scoffed at the idea of letting Deku walk her to work, mocking that Deku could not manage on his own. His laughter was sharp and loud. YN jumped back in shock and demanded clarification. Izuku moved closer, placing a steadying hand on YN's shoulder and quietly asking her to leave it alone. Katsuki stopped laughing and glared at Izuku before saying that YN would be late if she did not leave. YN told Bakugou firmly that she would not go anywhere with him and ordered him to leave her porch. Izuku patted YN on the shoulder and said he would see her later and asked about lunch. YN turned to glare at Izuku, incredulous. With a groan, she gave in and said fine just this once and told Bakugou to leave her alone afterward. Bakugou laughed and agreed, opening the door. YN stepped out onto the porch in a grumbling mood and stopped short when she saw a horse tied to the railing. She told Bakugou she was not riding that to school. Bakugou walked around her, untied the reins, and led the horse away from the porch, saying it was fine if she did not want to ride and urging her not to be late for work. YN followed reluctantly. As they walked down the driveway, Bakugou tried to engage her, asking what she had been doing for the past 2 years. YN shrugged and replied that she had been working. Bakugou rolled his eyes and the conversation dwindled. YN had no desire to talk and Bakugou resented the attitude. He inwardly asked himself what had happened to being a gentleman. They passed the saloon and Bakugou finally asked a question that had been on his mind. Why did she hate him and what had he done to deserve it? YN laughed and responded that the real question was what he had not done. She pointed out that he had been an antagonist to Izuku since they were children, bullying for no apparent reason. There was a quiet moment. Bakugou listened and then, unexpectedly, said he was sorry and that he would apologize to Izuku if that was what she wanted. YN stopped and really looked at him, considering that he might have changed more than she had expected while he was away. She hardly believed he had matured, and when Bakugou asked what she meant by wanting an apology, he answered that he would be the man she wanted if it meant he could be with her someday. He added that he would apologize 1,000,000 times to Izuku if it meant he could wake up to her face every day. 𝐻𝑤𝑗 took a shaky breath and told Bakugou that she did not think she could ever love him. His eyebrows furrowed and his jaw tightened, but he did not erupt into the explosive temper she had known. He said they would work on it and urged her to hurry so she would not be late for work. 2 years earlier, the country of Yue had been split into north and south. One side had embraced the ideals of a man known as All for One, while the other wanted him to face justice. 4 years All for One had been in the headlines for his extreme and hateful opinions, which had polarized the nation. All for One believed that women had no meaning and that they should be reduced to housekeepers and childbearers. He supported the blatant disrespect shown toward immigrants. He believed that Yue's blood should stay pure and that everyone else should die. 2 years earlier, All for One had begun campaigning to become president. If the current president would not make the changes he deemed necessary to preserve Yue, he would take power himself. In mid-January, President Nizu was assassinated by Tamura Shigaraki. There were eyewitnesses, but Tamura was never apprehended. After the death of one of Yue's finest leaders, the country plunged into war. Every man between the ages of 16 and 50 was conscripted to aid the North unless he lived in a southern state or had a medical exemption. When the time came for the men of Mighty River to leave for the front, the town outwardly celebrated. They were proud of their boys and hopeful that they were serving the country. Months later, as letters ceased to arrive, the town sank into a quiet depression. Families waited by the post office or at the train station, desperate for any sign that their loved ones were safe. For 2 years, Mighty River struggled with the loss of more than half its population. With most capable men gone, women and the elderly shouldered the burden and fought to keep the town functioning. It was surprising the town remained standing. Meanwhile, the conscripted men of the small western town faced brutal, chaotic battles in the east. The fighting felt savage and relentless. Southern soldiers fought without mercy or restraint, and generals often let them act as they wished. Most engagements dragged on until one side surrendered or was routed. Fewer than half of Mighty River's men survived. The final battle shattered the northern forces, yet the north still prevailed. News of All for One's apparent suicide spread, and with no leader the southern forces lost the will to fight and surrendered. When the surrender became public, the survivors were allowed to return home. Izuku was unsure how he had survived, emerging with a broken leg and bruised ribs. He was uncoordinated in combat and spent much of the fighting unconscious. Maybe it was luck or something beyond luck. Either way, he was grateful to be alive and back in his hometown with the woman he planned to marry. Izuku excused himself to the hens as he pulled open the large coop door, earning a few startled squawks from the birds. The door came off its hinges when he opened it, and he cringed at the mess he had made. He hobbled to the box of hardware he had fetched from the shack and knelt to search for a replacement latch. He found hammers, wrenches, nuts, bolts, and rope, but no screws. He sank back onto his heels with a sigh and scratched his bald head. He could stop by the general store. He had errands to run anyway, he thought. Using his good leg and steady hands, he pushed himself up and limped across the yard into the house. Mrs. Ellen was still sleeping, so he moved quietly to his room, fell onto the bed, and bent to fasten his boots. As he tied his laces, his thoughts drifted to 𝑌N. He sat up, squared his shoulders, and let the memories wash over him. He had known 𝑌N for 8 years. She had moved to Mighty River at 10, and they had quickly become friends. They had shared their best years together. Izuku remembered taking her to meet his mother for the first time and how happy his mother had been to meet a friend of his. He remembered teaching her to ride a horse and the time the horse spooked and she fell. It had been frightening but not his fault. He remembered the countless moments he had wanted to kiss her but had never done so. While away at war, Izuku had promised himself that if he survived, he would confess to 𝑌N and do his best to give her a good life. Now there was a problem he had not expected. Katsuki Bakugou had come between them. The memory of Bakugou made Izuku see red. The blonde had tormented him for 14 years. Once they had been friends, but everything fell apart after Izuku's father left and the Kirishima family arrived. Kirishima, kind and helpful, befriended Katsuki, but Katsuki became the issue. Katsuki's bullying had escalated until Izuku felt unworthy almost every day. The torment had not eased during their service, it had worsened. Izuku was almost certain that Katsuki's attention toward 𝐻𝑖𝐿 was meant to spite him. There was no way Katsuki truly cared for her. He had spent years picking on 𝐻𝑖𝐿 for being friends with Izuku. If he liked 𝐻𝑖𝐿, Izuku would have known. He was sure of it. Izuku was more observant than he let on, and he would not have missed something like that. The only real explanation for Katsuki's newfound kindness was that Katsuki was trying to spite Izuku. That made more sense than him actually liking 𝐻𝑖𝐿. Izuku shook his thoughts away with a sigh and told himself that was enough of the nonsense. He grunted and pushed himself to his feet. Whether Katsuki's feelings for 𝐻𝑖𝐿 were real or not did not matter. Izuku planned to marry her himself. Katsuki's feelings were irrelevant when Izuku was not the one involved in the state of Katsuki's relationship with 𝐻𝑖𝐿. With that in mind, Izuku stopped thinking about the blonde and grabbed his coin pouch from the dresser. He left his crutches by the closet and started to limp through the house, ignoring the sharp pain in his broken leg as best he could. To the right of the house was a small barn where the family kept horses and a cow. Izuku shuffled across the driveway to tack up a horse. Despite his injury, he was no stranger to preparing a mount. He fastened a saddle to an Appaloosa stallion named Speckles and fitted a bit in the horse's mouth. Speckles had been with the family since they moved here. Izuku led Speckles to a water trough to check the tack while the horse drank. He tightened the girth and adjusted the saddle so it would stay put. Speckles toyed with the bit as Izuku fixed the bridle and put the earpieces in place without fuss. Izuku went to the tack room, pulled down saddlebags, staggered back outside, and attached them. Once he had triple-checked everything, he placed his left foot in the stirrup, hauled himself into the saddle, secured his right foot, and took the reins in one hand. With a click of his tongue and a touch of his heels, Speckles moved steadily out of the yard and down the driveway. Izuku let the horse do most of the walking so he could look around. Mighty River had not changed much over the last 2 years. The 𝐻𝑖𝐿 house still stood alone, the nearest neighbor at the very end of their driveway. From there he could see a new pasture to the right, full of long-horned cattle grazing on brown grass. In town, Izuku noticed a few changes. Some new shops had opened, the sheriff's department building had expanded, and there were more horses tied up out front. He stopped Speckles in front of the general store, removed his right foot from the stirrup, and slid down, grunting when his broken leg bumped the dusty road. He closed his eyes, took a few steadying breaths, tied the reins to a fence post, retrieved his coin pouch from the saddlebags, and stepped inside. The shop smelled of skis and leather with a hint of dust, and Izuku smiled at the familiar comfort of it. Katsuki Bakugou gasped when she saw him and asked why he had not told her he was back. Izuku smiled and explained that he had meant to stop by after running errands but had forgotten she ran the shop now. Mitsuki asked where he was staying. Izuku replied that he was staying with 𝐻𝑖𝐿 and her mother until his leg healed. Mitsuki's eyebrows rose at that. She teased that perhaps grandchildren might be expected soon, a light-hearted remark meant to provoke. Izuku turned bright red and fumbled, making it clear that he was flustered and insisting that he was not courting 𝐻𝑖𝐿. At that moment, Katsuki passed by the store with Idru, loudly declaring that he would marry 𝐻𝑖𝐿 and that she would become family. Mitsuki tore her eyes from Katsuki's retreating figure and addressed Izuku directly, telling him bluntly that if he did not act, someone else would win her over, and he needed to be bolder. Izuku sighed and agreed that she was right. Mitsuki giggled and then asked if he needed anything else, indicating the items he held. Izuku scratched the back of his neck and asked if she had any screws. Chapter 7. He's determined. 3 o'clock arrived too quickly for 𝐻𝑖𝐿's liking. As soon as the town bell struck 3 times, her students erupted into noise and bolted out of the classroom faster than she expected. One moment they were listening, the next they were gone. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 blinked, turned to the now empty room, and walked the length of the classroom with her heels clicking on the wooden floor. The room looked untouched, as if no one had been there at all. It was strange considering a whole bunch of kids had spent the entire day in the schoolhouse. The young teacher set her stick of chalk down on the tray beneath the whiteboard and began walking around the room to make sure nothing had been left behind. She was walking down the second aisle when a floorboard outside the door creaked. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 looked over her shoulder expecting a student who had forgotten something, but she was met with disappointment. Katsuki stood on the porch with a cocky smile and a bouquet of wildflowers. Katsuki greeted her with a low chuckle and asked if she was ready to head home yet. 𝐻𝑗 scowled at him and told him to go home. She wondered if this was how her days at work would be now, being accompanied by this man. She continued her trek down the aisles, occasionally picking up pencils and books from the floor. Katsuki stepped through the threshold with a grunt, wandered over to her desk, set down the bouquet, and began walking down the aisles as well. Katsuki shook his head and said there was no chance he would leave yet, bending to pick up a half-eaten apple. 𝐻𝑗 stopped and stared at him, the scowl deepening on her face. She watched him go from desk to desk, gathering random trinkets. She demanded to know why he was doing this and asked him to be honest about what he wanted. Katsuki stopped and turned to face her without moving closer. He reminded her of what he had said that morning. He wanted to be with her. He admitted he had not always been kind and promised he had thought about his behavior while he was away. He said he would be better for her, that he would stop bullying Izuku, and if she let him walk her home, he would apologize to Izuku. He asked for a chance to prove he could be a better man. 𝐻𝑗 felt at a loss for words and could not decide what to say. She was unfamiliar with this side of Katsuki. She had only known him as someone with a terrible temper. Because of his personality, she had never thought of him romantically. He was attractive, but she had never imagined loving him, marrying him, or having a family with him. Now, with the possibility suddenly in front of her, she found herself considering what a relationship with him might look like. She pushed those thoughts aside and reminded herself she needed time to decide. 𝐻𝑗 asked for time to think. Katsuki said of course and told her to let him know when she had reached a conclusion. 𝐻𝑗 nodded and thanked him. He smiled but remained quiet. Together they cleaned up the schoolhouse, and when they finished it was nearly 4 o'clock. Katsuki offered her coat and said it was time to get her home. 𝐻𝑗 picked up the bouquet he had left on her desk and moved closer. He was patient, giving her the space she needed. In a quiet, tentative moment, she turned her back to him and slipped her arms into the coat. Katsuki adjusted it to make sure she was snug, then quietly offered his arm. 𝐻𝑗 hesitated, considering whether to accept. Part of her told herself it was just an arm and a kind gesture. Another part, shaped by the past 2 years, sensed there might be more to it. She placed her shaky hand on his tricep. Katsuki took a breath, cleared his throat, and asked if she was ready. 𝐻𝑗 nodded, and Katsuki patted her hand before leading her out of the schoolhouse and into town. She reminded herself to focus on one step at a time. Chapter 8. The Pie. When they reached her front steps, 𝐻𝑗 thanked him for the walk and the flowers. Katsuki acknowledged it with a nod. The evening was quiet except for her breathing, the crickets, distant cows, and voices from the square. 𝐻𝑗 squeezed her eyes shut, took a breath, and invited Katsuki inside for some pie, explaining she had baked a blueberry pie that morning and hoped some might remain. She turned and looked for Izuku at the door but found no one and heard nothing coming from inside. No dishes, no piano practice, no movement. 𝐻𝑗 said she did not want to impose and that it was getting late, then trailed off uncertainly. Katsuki hummed and offered a toothy grin, thanking her for the offer and suggesting maybe some other time. 𝐻𝑗 nodded and told him that was fine. She had only thought to offer because he had walked her to work and back, and everyone liked pie. Katsuki chuckled and said he was sure her pie was delicious and that he could take some home for his parents. 𝐻𝑗 agreed and added that she would give him whatever was left and could make another one if needed. She climbed the porch steps and pulled open both doors, holding them open for the blonde behind her. Katsuki began removing her coat without a word. It startled her, but she let it happen. Arguing with Katsuki over the years had led nowhere. He hung her coat on the hook behind the door, then took off his own jacket and hat. 𝐻𝑗 muttered that the kitchen was this way and walked straight down the hall. Katsuki followed more quietly, curious at last about the interior of a house he had wondered about since he was 12. On the outside it had always looked like a fancy house, 2 stories, longer than it was wide, a bright robin egg blue with white accents, 3 chimneys, and pretty flowers and berry bushes around the porch. Inside, however, it felt lived in and warm. 2 archways led to separate rooms, the staircase and parlor on the right and a study on the left. Straight down the hallway were the kitchen and dining room. Paintings, family portraits, plants, knitted decor, and antiques made it feel like a real home. Katsuki stopped at the kitchen doorway, not wanting to be in the way. Though the kitchen was large, he would still take up too much room, so he waited patiently. 𝐻𝑖𝐸, more nervous than she admitted, pulled a kitchen towel from a drawer to cover the pie and turned with the pan, explaining that Izuku had only had a few slices, so there was enough for each of them to have at least 2. Katsuki took the pan with a grateful smile and said he could not wait to try it. Their quiet was broken by the creak of a door opening down the hall. Izuku appeared, half asleep and yawning, and asked what Katsuki was doing there, trailing off when he noticed the pie. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 answered him, and Katsuki offered an apology to Izuku for bullying him when they were kids, saying that he knew it had been wrong and that he understood if Izuku did not accept the apology but wanted him to know he was sorry. Izuku froze in disbelief and stumbled back, whispering that it must be a dream. Katsuki snickered but confirmed he was being serious and repeated that he was sorry. The words sounded odd to him. He had said sorry before, but apologizing to the boy he had bullied all his life felt foreign. Still, he would say it again if it meant 𝐻𝑖𝐸 might give him a chance. Izuku gagged and murmured that he felt sick, turning away. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 asked if he was all right, and he nodded, asking for a minute. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 glanced at the setting sun through the window and, worrying about dinner, slipped her small hand onto Katsuki's shoulder and quietly told him it was time to go because she needed to start supper. Katsuki agreed, thanked her for the pie, wished them a good evening, and left after putting his jacket and hat back on. Izuku and 𝐻𝑖𝐸 watched him walk down the driveway, and Izuku finally demanded to know why Katsuki had the pie. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 fidgeted, searching for the words, and then confessed that Katsuki wanted to marry her. Izuku reacted with stunned disbelief, his head snapping toward her and his expression open and shocked. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 stuttered that Katsuki wanted to marry her and took a deep breath. She could see Izuku's eyes gloss over and felt a pang of guilt. She knew, deep down, that Izuku loved her in more than a platonic way. She wasn't that dumb. Maybe that was why she had a hard time registering Katsuki's proposal. Maybe it was because she knew that by marrying her best friend's childhood bully, she would literally break the poor guy. Izuku could not believe it when he heard the news. He instantly wondered if he was too late. The thought that his best friend might marry the bane of his existence made his eyes sting. The idea of 𝐻𝑖𝐸 loving Katsuki made him want to cry out. Izuku wiped his nose with the back of his flannel sleeve and kept his gaze on the floor, unable to look at 𝐻𝑖𝐸 without tearing up. He asked whether she planned to marry Katsuki, his voice low and hoarse. He had been peacefully asleep before Katsuki had come to the house. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 released a shaky breath and tried to look away. She rubbed her hands against the front of her skirt and intertwined her fingers to stop fidgeting. She admitted that she did not know. Izuku tensed. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 tried to explain that she was not getting any younger. She said that many girls her age were already starting families and that her mother had not approved of any suitors. She said she did not want to be alone for the rest of her life and that she wanted to experience love the way her parents had. If that meant being with Katsuki, then she thought she could accept it. Tears streamed down Izuku's cheeks. He had not realized how easily someone could take 𝐻𝑖𝐸 away from him. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 trailed off with a low sigh and admitted that she did not know what she was saying. Izuku finally looked up at her, eyes wide, and asked if she meant someone else. He tilted his head, trying to meet her gaze. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 only shrugged. Izuku declared that he would not let her accept Katsuki's proposal. He said that he had been too much of a coward these past few years to tell her how he felt and that he was angry with himself for not doing it sooner. He confessed that he loved her, that he had loved her since they first met, and that if he had admitted it earlier they might have been married now. He told her that he did not want to dwell on what could have been when he could focus on what still might be. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 began to cry. She sniffled and reached up to dab at her eyes. Izuku begged her not to accept Katsuki's proposal, calling Katsuki difficult and saying that 𝐻𝑖𝐸 deserved better. He asked for the chance to love her properly and promised, invoking the memory of his mother, that he would never mistreat her. He vowed to love her with everything he had, to provide for her, and to care for her until the end of his days. 𝐻𝑖𝐸 murmured that she did not know what to say. Izuku moved into the kitchen and stood in front of 𝐻𝑖𝐸. He rested his large hands on her shoulders and squeezed the fabric of her white blouse. He told her she did not have to decide right away and that he was not going anywhere. He tried to lighten the moment with a small chuckle and then encouraged her to go take a bath, offering to handle supper. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 asked about his injured leg. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 rolled his eyes playfully and assured her he would be fine, telling her to go. She turned and climbed the stairs while keeping her eyes on him the whole time. He waited until he heard the water running, and when he did he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He had finally confessed, and though he worried about Katsuki, he felt a strange relief. Chapter 9. I Love You. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 did not sleep much that night. He spent the hours wrestling with worst-case scenarios. What if she accepted Katsuki's proposal? What if Katsuki took her away? What if he had waited too long to confess? He tossed and turned in his temporary bed, anxious to start the day and learn what decision she had made. By morning, 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 had not slept. He had imagined a future where 𝑌𝑁 belonged to Katsuki, where she raised Katsuki's children and tended to his home. The thought made it hard to rest. Warm sunlight spilled through the tall windows of his room as birds began to chirp. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 could hear the distant sounds of the farm waking, chickens in the coop, cows in the fields, and the faint clamor from town. He sat up, yawned, ran a hand over his prickly hair and stretched. His joints popped and cracked, and for a moment his body eased. After a pause, he climbed out of bed and began preparing for the day. It was Saturday, which meant 𝑌𝑁 would be home all day. Grateful for the thought, 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 got a head start on the morning chores so she could sleep in without worrying about the animals or breakfast. The pain in his leg reminded him to move carefully. He left his crutches in his room and took his time hobbling to the kitchen. He paused to decide whether to prepare breakfast first or tend to the chickens, and for a moment he thought of how his mother had always done breakfast before the animals. In the end, the order did not matter much. After a short period of thought, 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 went through the motions of letting the chickens out and collecting the eggs. Afterwards, he walked around the house to the barn where he broke up a bale of hay and delivered a slice to each of the animals inhabiting the stalls. He hadn't milked a cow in 2 years, but he sat in the cow's stall and began to milk it. By 8 a.m. he was back inside with a heavy bucket of fresh milk and a basket of eggs. He was in the process of putting the eggs away when he heard the stairs creak. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 looked over his shoulder just in time to see 𝑌𝑁 come down the stairs, still wearing her nightgown and still half asleep. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 called out a good morning as he turned back around. 𝑌𝑁 yawned and asked what he was doing up so early, noting that it was a Saturday. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 said he had wanted to let her sleep in and asked if she had any requests for breakfast. 𝑌𝑁 took a seat at the dining table, blinked against the drowsiness, and told him that Mitsuki had given her some grain recently and she had fresh strawberries, asking if porridge would be okay. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 replied that it would be fine. They fell into a comfortable silence. While 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 worked on breakfast, 𝑌𝑁 tried to wake up. She set her head in her hands and studied the rough grain of the wood in the kitchen table, willing the lingering drowsiness to leave. When she realized she wouldn't just pass out in her seat, 𝑌𝑁 left 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 to go upstairs and get herself together. She dragged herself up the stairs and down the hall to what used to be her parents' bedroom. The master bedroom sat at the very end of the hall. Before the war, her parents had called it theirs. About a year after her father left, her mother had handed it over to her. 𝑌𝑁 softly closed the door behind her and immediately pulled off her nightgown. The stale air in the room nudged her to get dressed quickly. She stood in front of her dresser and dug through her options. She did not have any special plans for the day besides caring for the house and going shopping around noon, so she picked a simple combination, a plain white blouse and a forest-colored skirt. She put on her undergarments, then the skirt and blouse, and pinned her hair in a loose updo. A pair of tall, worn boots completed the outfit. Once she was satisfied she looked decent, 𝑌𝑁 left her room and headed downstairs. Her boots clicked against the hardwood floors, alerting 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 to her presence. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 turned and nearly stopped. He thought she looked stunning. 𝑌𝑁 asked if he had any plans for the day as she took a seat at the dining table, offering a small smile. 𝐰𝑖𝑍𝑜 blinked and said he did not have much planned and asked why. 𝑌𝑁 explained that she needed to get groceries and wondered if he would like to accompany her. She also planned to stop by his place to pick up some of his things and asked how long his leg would take to heal. Izuku shrugged and explained that he had broken it about a month ago and estimated it would take about 2 months to heal, asking if that would be okay. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 said that was fine and that she only wanted to know how much to get for him. After breakfast, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 flitted around the house tidying. She straightened up the parlor, swept the porches, and began collecting dirty laundry. It was Saturday laundry day, so when she had a chance she planned to take the pile outside and work through the chore. Before Izuku returned from the war, the laundry had not been terrible. Her mother rarely changed out of her nightgown, so it had mostly been 𝐻𝑖𝐿's clothes. Now she had both her own and Izuku's to manage. It would be a lot of work, but it was manageable. Outside, Izuku tended to the horses in the barn. There were 3, Speckles, an Appaloosa stallion, Goldilocks, a strong Palomino mare, and Ricky, a retired carriage horse. He gave each horse half a hay bale with a side of oats, then began sweeping out the barn. The wind carried away dust and bits of straw. He swept until there was nothing left to sweep and let his thoughts turn to the day's tasks. He reminded himself he had to clean the tack and fix the pasture. Multiple sections of the pasture had been broken down from neglect, and he could only assume the animals hadn't been in a grassy field in years. Fixing the pasture was a top priority, but he wondered if there would be enough time between shopping and the trip back to the Midoriya estate. The tack job was time-consuming even if the items were few: 2 saddles, 2 bridles, 2 girths to clean and polish, several saddle pads that needed washing, and numerous attachments and bags to sort and freshen. It would take all of today and part of tomorrow if he was lucky. First, he needed to address the pasture. He set the broom aside and limped toward the pasture to assess the damage. 2 pastures lined the driveway, but the family used only one, and that one was in shambles from years of neglect. A few boards were missing from the fence, and the water trough near the gate had clearly seen better days. If he had everything he needed, he could repair the fence by noon. If not, he would pick up supplies when he and 𝐻𝑖𝐿 went into town. With that decision made, he limped across the driveway toward the workshop. Mr. L.N.'s workshop had once been the family's garage, and now it was full of tools and blueprints. Scraps of metal sat in heaps, and small wooden models lined shelves. Izuku did his best to focus on gathering the materials he needed and to avoid snooping through the old projects. Izuku searched through L.N.'s things, looking for long wooden planks and nails. He found the nails easily, but the planks were harder to locate. In the end, he did not find what he was looking for. He sighed and packed a small wooden box with the tools he would need to prepare the pasture fence. Once he was sure he had everything, he left the dusty workshop, set the toolbox on the porch, and went into the house. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 heard the front door close behind him and called from the parlor, asking if he had any dirty laundry. She was in the middle of sorting clothes. Her system made laundry take longer but kept delicate items and heavy linens properly cared for. Izuku peered into the parlor and saw her seated on the couch with several large wooden baskets of laundry in front of her. He offered with a small smile that he could go get his basket if she wanted. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 smiled and thanked him. Izuku nodded and went to his room to fetch his laundry. While he was gone, she separated the whites, darks, colors, delicates, and a miscellaneous basket for towels, sheets, and rugs, making 5 baskets in total. When Izuku returned with his basket, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 made room by pushing the others aside. He set his basket down and she thanked him again. He returned the gratitude with a quiet smile. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 told him that they could leave around noon and asked him to make a list of everything she would need from the grocery store and his house. Izuku agreed and politely asked if she wanted anything else. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 declined, so he left her to finish sorting while he wrote the lists. Chapter 11, A Chance. Immediately after lunch, Izuku went to Mr. L.N.'s workshop to ready the wagon. Since they planned to run errands, they would need plenty of space for whatever they brought home. The wagon was an old chuck wagon 𝐻𝑖𝐿 had started using 2 years earlier. It was a little beat up, a wheel looked like it might give out, and a few boards were missing, but it still worked. Before 𝐻𝑖𝐿 emerged, Izuku spent a few minutes repairing what he could. He fixed the wheel and tightened screws to make sure the wagon would hold together for the trip. When he was satisfied, he went to fetch Speckles and Goldilocks. He would not have chosen Ricky. The mare was nearly 25 and too old to be pulling a wagon. Speckles and Goldilocks were similar in size and strength, so they should manage the load without trouble. Izuku whistled a low tune as he tied the two horses to a post outside the workshop. Because the horses had been kept indoors and needed exercise, he brushed each one down, stretched their muscles, and braided their manes and tails so nothing would get caught. He was adjusting the reins on Goldilocks' 𝐻𝑗 when gravel crunched behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, smiled briefly, and returned to the task. 𝐻𝑗 arrived and set her things in the wagon, asking if he was almost ready to go. Izuku nodded and indicated one more adjustment and they would be ready. 𝐻𝑗 climbed into the wagon without fuss, took the reins in hand, and Izuku climbed in beside her. She gathered all 4 reins, and when Izuku gave her a final thumbs up she clicked her tongue and flicked the reins. Speckles and Goldilocks stepped forward in unison and 𝐻𝑗 guided them down the driveway toward town. The drive passed in companionable silence. Both were lost in thought. There were many things between them they both wanted to say, but neither found the courage in that moment. Izuku decided they did not have to talk right away and watched the scenery change as they neared town. By the time they reached the main street, the Saturday crowd had filled the streets. Traffic slowed to a crawl near the sheriff's office. While they waited, 𝐻𝑗 set the reins in her lap and checked her list aloud to herself, then asked Izuku if anything was missing. He went over the items in his head and shook his head. Nothing essential had been overlooked. 𝐻𝑗 folded the paper and tucked it into her coin pouch, then told him she needed to stop by Mr. Takami's for chickens, and that they could visit his place while they were out. Their first stop was the produce store. Izuku watched the wagon while 𝐻𝑗 purchased the fruit and vegetables they would need for the coming week. Thankfully, a general store stood beside the grocer, so 𝐻𝑗 went there next and picked up saddle polish, nails, some tools, flour, and sugar. Izuku drove them to the brewery on the other side of town, where 𝐻𝑗 collected her monthly order of wine and bought a bottle of whiskey she thought Izuku would like. A grain store a block away supplied the hay and chicken feed. Izuku offered to help, and he asked if she was sure she did not need assistance. 𝐻𝑗 grunted as she lifted 2 bales of hay into the back of the wagon and insisted she was fine. He frowned. She knew he was capable, but she had managed on her own for 2 years and did not want pity or unnecessary help. After brushing pieces of hay from her skirt, she rounded the wagon and asked if they were going to the lumberyard. Izuku sighed and nodded, flicked the reins, and they set off. The lumberyard in Mighty River was a 30-minute drive from the brewery. The original settlers had chosen to be closer to water than wood. It was quiet for a long moment before Izuku decided to break the silence. He needed to talk, and he had stopped avoiding it. He addressed 𝐻𝑗 by name and asked whether she was really thinking about accepting Kaken's proposal. 𝐻𝑗 pursed her lips and hesitated. She wondered why she had not simply told Katsuki no, and why she was even considering a future with him. A part of her tried to list the reasons to say yes, but she shut that down quickly. She admitted to herself that she did not know what she thought. Izuku listened with a shaky breath and then asked whether he had a chance. 𝐻𝑗 turned to look at him properly, not as a friend but as someone she could imagine spending the rest of her life with. They had been inseparable since they met. They were best friends. She pictured a life where Izuku was more than that: her partner, provider, protector, and companion. She imagined children and a home together, and the thought warmed her. Izuku began to feel anxious with the silence, worried about the answer he might receive. 𝐻𝑗 finally told him that he did have a chance. Chapter 12. 𝐼𝐇𝐈𝐂𝐇 Midoriya. Izuku Midoriya had grown up on one of the largest cattle ranches in Mighty River. His mother, 𝐼𝐇𝐈𝐂𝐇 Midoriya, had worked as a nanny for the ranch owner until Izuku turned 15. She had worked hard for the Todoroki family for nearly 16 years so that she could eventually buy her own place. Just down the lane from the Todoroki ranch stood a small 2-bedroom cabin where Izuku spent the rest of his adolescence. The cabin sat on 3 acres and had cost 𝐼𝐇𝐈𝐂𝐇 all her savings, but despite the price it meant the world to her. Izuku and his mother lived together in that cabin for 3 years before 𝐼𝐇𝐈𝐂𝐇 sadly passed away, leaving the property to her son a few months after his 18th birthday. The last time Izuku had seen the cabin was 2 years earlier on his way to the capital. Now, 2 years later, he stood in front of the rundown cabin with tears in his eyes. The war had aged him, and neglect had aged the house. Dust covered the windows, the porch sagged, a banister bowed, and green plants grew between the wooden planks. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 climbed down from the wagon and circled to Izuku's side, taking his hand and squeezing it. She asked quietly if he wanted her to come in with him. He shook his head and muffled that he thought he would be okay. With her help, he got down from the wagon and hobbled inside. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 watched him go in with a furrowed brow, then turned to hitch the horses to a nearby post so they would not wander off. She walked the property, assessing the damage and making a mental list of repairs needed to restore the cabin. There was more work than she first thought, but it was work she would gladly do. Back on the porch, she turned to take in the land around the cabin. There was not much space for a herd, but she could imagine a horse or two, donkeys, and chickens. A barn would have to be built, but that was manageable. Lost in daydreams of what the property could become and what life with Izuku might look like, she pictured faceless children with green hair running about and Izuku working contentedly under the sun. She imagined a dog from one of the local families and maybe a cat or two. She was so absorbed that she did not notice Izuku stepping down the porch until he cleared his throat and tapped her shoulder. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 jumped and then asked if he had gotten everything. She ignored the flush in her cheeks and untied the horses so they could head home. Izuku handed his sack of clothes to 𝐻𝑖𝐿, tossed a toolbox into the wagon, and climbed in himself. He moved across the bench to take the reins and explained that most of his old clothes no longer fit, but he had found a few things that would do. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 acknowledged this with a hum, then turned the horses around in the driveway and stepped into the wagon. She settled against the bench with a yawn and said she was ready for a nap. Izuku flicked the reins and urged the horses forward, telling her she could sleep on the way since it would be a long drive. When 𝐻𝑖𝐿 asked if he was sure, he reassured her, and she leaned in closer and rested her head on his shoulder, falling asleep within moments. Chapter 13, Corsets and Petticoats. Monday arrived faster than either 𝐻𝑖𝐿 or Izuku would have liked. When 𝐻𝑖𝐿 opened her eyes, she felt as if the weekend had been pulled right out from under her. The only proof it had happened was the warm memories of the first weekend they had spent together in 2 years. She lay in bed a few minutes, replaying those memories. On Saturday they had gone shopping, then worked together to repair one of the pastures, fixing holes in the fence and repairing the gate. When they finished, they turned the horses out for the first time in years and watched the 3 animals explore and graze for hours before 𝐻𝑖𝐿 had to start dinner. That evening they sat on the back porch, shared drinks, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 with a glass of wine and Izuku with a glass of whiskey, and talked for hours to catch up on the 2 years they had been apart. On Sunday they worked outdoors again, tending the garden and, after lunch, cleaning the horses' tack, a slow but satisfying task. That night also ended on the back porch with more drinks and easy conversation. Now it was Monday, and 𝐻𝑖𝐿 woke with a pounding head and the nagging sense that she had drunk too much the night before. She hauled herself up with a groan, scratched at her hair, and gave herself a moment to wake fully. When she rose to the edge of the bed and stretched, a series of satisfying pops came from her stiff joints and she let out a low breath. She blinked rapidly until she felt alert enough to get dressed. She had to be at the schoolhouse at least half an hour before classes started to make sure she had everything she needed, so she moved quickly. In short order she selected a long light blue skirt, a long-sleeved button-up, and an old shawl in case it got cold. She tied her hair into a loose bun with a ribbon and skipped makeup, then went downstairs. Movement in the kitchen told her Izuku was already up. She walked in with a bright grin and gave him a brief, warm hug from behind, greeting him and tightening her hold for a moment before letting go to pour herself a cup of orange juice. Izuku returned the greeting with a relaxed good morning and admitted he was all right. He asked after her, and 𝐻𝑖𝐿 leaned against the counter, watching him scramble eggs in the iron pan while she admitted her head hurt. He hummed in response and continued preparing breakfast. When he served a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 thanked him and took a seat at the dining table. They ate in companionable silence, enjoying the food and one another's company. As she pulled on her dusty black boots by the front door, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 asked what he planned to do while she was at the schoolhouse. Izuku shrugged in the parlor doorway and said he was not sure. He might check around the property for needed repairs or spend the day working with the horses. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 frowned at the answer and thought that she would trade places in a heartbeat to work outside with the horses instead of teaching inside. She loved being a teacher and valued providing the children of Mighty River with a good education, But some days, especially Mondays, the job tested her patience. She tightened her laces, straightened her skirt, and wished him fun before heading out. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 watched her for a moment, taking in the sight of her with a quiet, appreciative look, convinced she had never looked more lovely. She had been pretty before he went off to war, but 2 years apart somehow made her even more striking. The young woman who once dressed in corsets and petticoats with curled hair and bright makeup from up north was gone. 2 years of hard work on her own had changed her, though not for the worse. She rarely wore makeup now and no longer spent time curling her hair. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 thought she probably no longer owned petticoats, perhaps only a corset or two. Her appearance had changed as much as her personality. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 had loved 𝐲𝑁 before he left. He had loved the frills and the curls, her gentle exterior and trusting instincts. Their time apart had only deepened his feelings. He found himself falling for her all over again. He drew a shaky breath and stood to his full height. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 told her she should get going because he did not want her to be late. 𝐲𝑁 nodded and said that was fine. For a moment they stood in silence, both feeling that something more ought to be said. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 broke the quiet. He opened his arms with a wide smile and softly invited her to come closer. 𝐲𝑁 crossed the small distance and wrapped her arms around his waist. He settled his hands on her shoulders. They stood like that, sharing warmth. 𝐲𝑁 breathed him in, fingers curling in the fabric of his flannel. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on the crown of her head, a tender gesture that made her preen with pleasure. They would have stayed like that indefinitely if not for a rough knock at the door. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 stiffened and 𝐲𝑁 reluctantly drew away. When she opened the door she found Bakugou standing there with a bouquet of wildflowers and a dazzling smile. Before taking his rough hand she turned back and gave 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 a wide smile, telling him she would see him later and addressing him as Aizu. 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 watched Bakugou escort her down the driveway with a heavy scowl, his dislike for the man growing as they disappeared around the corner. When the path cleared, 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 shut the door and went on with his duties. Chapter 14. Mrs. Bakugou. Bakugou asked how her weekend had been. 𝐲𝑁 pressed her lips together and said it had been all right, adding that 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 had helped her with some tasks. Bakugou rolled his eyes at the mention of 𝐰𝐸𝑂𝐇 but kept his thoughts to himself. He told her that if she needed help with anything he was around, since he did not do much these days. 𝐲𝑁 thanked him and said she would keep that in mind. After a pause, Bakugou asked when her horses had last seen a farrier. 𝐲𝑁 stopped and asked what a farrier was. Bakugou froze in shock and told her that it had been 2 years, asking if anyone had come out to see the horses. 𝐲𝑁 shook her head and muttered that no one had. Bakugou struggled to hold back anger at the apparent neglect but forced himself to reason that she had not grown up around a town like Mighty River and might not know the needs of horses. He huffed that he would come out later to check them and urged her to head to the schoolhouse. They began walking down the lane and 𝐲𝑁 slipped her arm through his when she could. Bakugou tried to hide his smile but failed. He muttered that he would see her later. 𝐲𝑁 thanked him for walking her and for agreeing to come out later, and Bakugou smiled and said of course. They said their goodbyes and 𝐲𝑁 ducked into the schoolhouse to prepare for the day. She opened the windows to air the room and swept the floor. She arranged the desks, set out spare pencils, wrote the day's agenda on the chalkboard, and placed copies of a new book on the students' desks. By the time she set the last book down the children began to arrive. The students greeted her cheerfully as they filed in. 𝐲𝑁 took her seat at the desk and marked attendance. Then one of the children, Okado Hannah, called her Mrs. Bakugou. 𝐲𝑁 looked up in surprise. Hannah explained that her mother had said 𝐲𝑁 would be marrying Mr. Bakugou, and that Hannah had assumed she was already married. 𝐲𝑁 rose and knelt to meet Hannah at eye level. She began to explain to Hannah that she and Mr. Bakugou had a relationship. 𝐲𝑁 explained that he was courting her and that it could eventually lead to marriage. It did not dawn on her until that moment that marriage might be the outcome of everything with Bakugou. Hannah hummed and asked if she was not Mrs. Bakugou. 𝐲𝑁 shook her head and explained that she was still Miss 𝐲𝑁. Hannah frowned briefly before replacing the expression with a bright smile and wished Miss 𝐲𝑁 a good morning. She then bounced off to join a group of little girls by the door. 𝐲𝑁 straightened, sighed, and walked back to her desk to wait for the rest of the children to arrive. Izuku stared up at the schoolhouse with a small frown. The sunlight beat down, making sweat form on his brow and his face feel hot. It was lunchtime, and instead of returning to the LN house to do chores, he had decided to walk into town to have lunch with YN. He was unsure when school let out, but he was certain it would be soon. The schoolhouse where YN taught sat in a quieter part of town, surrounded by houses and barns more than shops, but still full of life. He watched women tending gardens, hanging laundry, and sitting on porches talking with neighbors. Small children too young for school played in yards and ran through the street. Such domestic scenes warmed Izuku's heart. He wanted children of his own one day and imagined settling down with a certain schoolteacher. He would give anything to live in a home like the ones he saw, sharing days with a wife, tending to a garden, watching children grow. He would not mind working hard to support that life. Time with the woman he loved was all he wanted. He blinked and suddenly there were children everywhere. Chapter 15, Lunch. YN stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, looking as pleasant as ever. Izuku's breath caught at the sight of her, his heart skipped and his hands trembled. After a moment he steadied himself and tried to speak. YN had been outside for a while. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows and she looked warm from the heat. Izuku stammered that he was there for lunch and, after a shaky pause, asked if she would like to have lunch with him. He explained that he had brought bacon, baked potatoes, chicken, and some cornbread she had made the day before. He admitted he was not great in the kitchen but had tried, and added that he had brought some wine. YN smiled and said she would love to have lunch with him and that she was quite hungry. She descended the steps to shorten the distance between them and agreed to sit together. They walked to an empty picnic table off to the side of the schoolhouse. YN helped Izuku set out the food. He had brought 2 plates, cloth napkins, and utensils, but had forgotten glasses for the wine. YN told him she had some glasses inside and said she would be right back, using the nickname Aizu as she went back into the building. Izuku watched her go with wide, green eyes until she disappeared around the corner. Children clustered in shaded spots to eat and talk with friends. Some ran and played, others gazed up at the sky. Watching them brought back memories of his own school days. Long hours reading beneath a tree behind the building, and afternoons when YN had sat with him under that same tree helping him understand grammar. Those memories were of a simpler, peaceful time before the burdens of adulthood and war. He missed those days but was grateful for how much he had grown and the stories he now had to tell. His stomach rumbled. He had not eaten since morning and had been busy working. Earlier that day, after YN left, he had gone to the barn to tend to the horses' hooves. They had needed attention, and he had taken the proper tools to shave and care for them. By the time he finished, the horses had fresh hooves and new shoes, and Izuku had worked up a fierce appetite. He did not have long to wait. From behind a nearby tree, Hannah watched as YN filled 2 glasses with the bitter red wine and the large man with a buzzed head and freckles took a seat. Hannah observed the man plate food for YN and then make a plate for himself. YN and the man began to eat, and Hannah saw YN smile and laugh, though she could not hear their conversation. She wondered about Mr. Katsuki Bakugou and whether he still intended to marry her teacher, or if someone else might have the same hope. She definitely had some questions for her mother. YN thanked Izuku for lunch and said it had been delicious as she sipped her wine. Izuku packed up what was left of their meal while YN students crowded back into the schoolhouse. For a moment it was just YN and Izuku in the yard, and they both allowed themselves a small, quiet reprieve. Izuku admitted that he would love to do this again. YN smiled into her glass and returned that she would too. When the moment stretched on, YN finished her wine, stood, brushed off her skirt, and fastened the buttons of her blouse. She offered Izuku a hug, which he accepted. He wrapped his arms around her shoulders and she tucked her head against his chest, her arms around his waist. The embrace was brief but meaningful, through it she conveyed her gratitude. Izuku was the first to pull away, uneasy at the thought of being seen, and he took a few steps back. He said that he had more work to do back at the house and asked if they would see each other later that evening. YN nodded and told him she would be home around 4:30 and added that Bakugou was planning to come by to look at the horse's feet. With his back to her as he finished packing the picnic, Izuku rolled his eyes and asked why. 𝑖𝐿 crossed her arms and shrugged, admitting she was not sure but that Bakugou had mentioned something about a farrier. Since he would be arriving late, she asked if it would be all right for him to join them for dinner. Izuku wanted to refuse. He wanted to say there was no need for Bakugou to come because he had already checked the horses, who were turned out in the pasture. He wanted to say he preferred an evening with just her, like the weekend they had shared. Instead he hummed and nodded, saying that it should be fine and that another set of eyes would not hurt. 𝐿 clapped her hands, thanked him again for lunch, and asked if they could do it again that week. Izuku turned to her with the basket in hand and a sincere smile, saying he would see her at home. He watched 𝐿 turn and walk away until she rounded a corner and the children's cheers drifted back. After thinking over the plans for the evening, he began the trek home. He had not brought a horse, so he walked all the way back to the 𝐿 estate. The walk was tiring, but he managed. The trip gave him time to plan the chores he would tackle before 𝐿 arrived. Tidying the back porch, washing the kitchen floor, organizing the cellar, and if time allowed, repairing the wagon. He had several hours to work. Chapter 16, Beer. There were 2 schoolhouses in Mighty River, one for each teacher, built parallel to one another. On the same lane, the older children studied in the larger building across the street under Shota Aizawa, while the younger ones learned from Miss 𝐿. Every day the school day ended at 3. 𝐿 and Mr. Aizawa stood between their doorways to wish the children farewell as they made their way home, the younger ones running and laughing while the older students walked more slowly. When the last child had gone, the 2 teachers exchanged smiles and sometimes a wave before setting their classrooms back in order. Aizawa usually finished before 𝐿, and she often watched him mount his horse and ride toward the outskirts. He lived alone in a cottage about 2 miles away, a solitude she knew he had come to appreciate. Over the last 2 years the teachers had spent many evenings at 𝐿's house grading papers and planning lessons. They were close friends, and she valued that companionship. 𝐿 was sweeping when the wood of the doorstep creaked beneath someone's weight. She did not need to look up to know it was Bakugou. Without a word he set a bouquet of flowers he had brought on a nearby desk and began picking up books scattered across the tables. 𝐿 had been reading an assortment of fairy tales with her students, and he gathered the books and returned them to her desk. By the time he finished, 𝐿 had completed sweeping but there was still work to do. She assigned him to wipe down the windows while she cleaned out the closet. By 4 the schoolhouse was clean and ready for the next day. 𝐿 took her shawl and the bouquet Bakugou had brought, locked the door, and linked her arm with his so he could walk her home. They walked in companionable silence. Both welcomed the quiet after their long days, 𝐿 after managing boisterous children, Bakugou after a strenuous day at the Todoroki ranch training new hands and moving cattle. He had been exhausted, but seeing 𝐿 brightened him. When her house came into view, 𝐿 told Bakugou that Izuku had already tended to the horse's feet but had said it would be fine for him to take a look. Bakugou's eyebrows rose in surprise and he demanded to know when Izuku had done that. 𝐿 explained that Izuku had brought her lunch that afternoon and had mentioned it then. Bakugou frowned and, frustrated that a task he had expected to perform was already completed, asked sharply why he was even coming out. 𝐿 paused and fumbled with the hem of her shawl, explaining that she had thought it would be nice if he joined them for dinner. Bakugou felt irritated. In his mind, since the work was already done, there was no reason for him to be there. Even though 𝐿 was offering him dinner, Bakugou felt as though he had made the trip for nothing. Before he exploded, he took a few deep breaths and ran a hand over his head. He huffed that dinner sounded lovely and patted her hand. 𝐿 offered a tight-lipped smile to the large man. She could read him easily and knew he was not happy, so she kept her mouth shut and let him guide her all the way up to her house. She opened the door and let him inside. They were both greeted by the clean scent of mint as soon as they entered the foyer. 𝐿 was surprised to see the hardwood floors sparkling in the sunlight and smiled despite herself. She had not had the chance to wash them in weeks. 𝐿 pointed to an empty hook on the coat rack and indicated he could hang his coat there. She bent down to peel off her boots, then stood and removed her shawl to set it on the bench beneath the rack. Bakugou hung his denim jacket on the hook but kept his boots on. He followed 𝐿 into the kitchen, which felt quaint with him standing inside. fancy blue and white tile covered the floor and dark blue beadboard complemented a floral wallpaper on all 4 walls. To his right was the cooking area with a large stove and porcelain sink. To his left was a dining nook with a small circular table and 2 chairs, the door to the backyard sitting nearby. Floating shelves above the table held non-perishables and trinkets, while green plants decorated the counters and a large rug took up much of the floor space. 𝐻𝑚 suggested he take a seat at the small table while she began preparing dinner. Without a word, he did as she asked and watched her set out ingredients and work at the stove. A small smile softened his features as he observed her check on the brisket and chop vegetables for a soup. Bakugou had never pictured himself as the domestic type settling down, sharing meals with a partner, a home that felt lived in, but watching 𝐻𝑚 move through the kitchen made the idea of a simple domestic life seem possible. He enjoyed the quiet and the chance to relax after the day. When Izuku came through the back door with a toolbox, Bakugou felt no resentment. Instead of scowling, he smiled and greeted him warmly, asking how he was. Izuku, unaccustomed to friendly conversation with Bakugou, hesitated but returned the greeting after an encouraging smile from 𝐻𝑚. He explained that he had just finished fixing up the shed out back and asked how Bakugou was doing. Bakugou shrugged and said he was all right, it could be worse. Izuku nodded and, moving past 𝐻𝑚 to set his toolbox on the table, gave her a puzzled look that she ignored as she focused on the soup. Before either man could continue the conversation, 𝐻𝑚 sent them outside under the pretense of checking on the horse's hooves. They walked quietly through the house and out to the barn. Neither man felt inclined to speak without 𝐻𝑚 nearby. Izuku guided Bakugou to the stalls where the horses were finishing their dinner. Bakugou reminded Izuku that 𝐻𝑚 had said he had already looked at the horse's feet earlier. Izuku confirmed he had and began pulling out his equipment again just in case. He mumbled that the hooves were not in bad shape and could have been worse. Izuku brought one of the horses, Speckles, into the center of the barn and secured him for inspection. Bakugou studied the hooves in their natural position and decided they looked fine. The horse stood straight and the hooves were well-shaped. When he picked up a front foot to check Izuku's work, Bakugou found no cause for complaint and acknowledged silently that Izuku had done a good job. He realized with a small sag of his shoulders that Izuku had experience on a ranch as well. Izuku offered to show the other 2 horses, but Bakugou declined, saying he trusted Izuku's work. Izuku resisted the urge to beam at the compliment, put Speckles back in his stall, and stowed his tools. On impulse he asked if Bakugou would like a beer, and before he could take the offer back, Bakugou had accepted. Chapter 17. The City. Later, in a more relaxed setting, Bakugou burst into laughter as he recounted a neighborhood rumor, telling Izuku that a woman had tried to claim a child was his when, in his view, the child clearly resembled Zero. Izuku joined in the laughter and tipped back in his rocking chair. The child Bakugou described was a spitting image of his father. Tan skin, short black hair, and the same square smile, clearly not resembling Bakugou at all. Katsuki found the idea of someone trying to pass off a child that did not resemble him absurd. He scoffed and recalled a past instance of a woman who had tried to pin something on him. He laughed the memory off. Izuku raised an eyebrow and took a sip from his beer, unprepared for the kind of story Katsuki was telling. He could not begin to make sense of it, but despite his lack of experience he listened, laughed when appropriate, and offered comfort when it seemed needed. He felt grateful for the evening. Katsuki, for his part, had definitely changed, no longer the cruel bully of their youth but a grown man with his own temperament. Izuku was glad he could talk to him without being teased. Both men leaned back in their chairs and took another swig. Katsuki snickered and admitted that Deku was not as bad as he had once thought. Izuku's eyebrows lifted. He wondered whether Katsuki had truly changed or was playing a role, and he found himself pondering whether real change was possible. When dinner was ready, 𝐻𝑚 carefully plated the food and carried it toward the parlor, smiling at the sound of the boys laughing on the porch. She went back to the kitchen to fetch 2 more beers and a bottle of wine, and then she heard the stairs creak. Cautiously, she peered up and saw her mother, all dressed up and carrying 2 briefcases. 𝐻𝑚 called out to her mother. Her mother looked down, smiled for the first time in years, and hurried to embrace her. 𝐻𝑚 returned the hug, though somewhat reluctantly, and asked where she was headed. Her mother explained that she was going back to the city to live with her sister for a while, to try to work on herself. She admitted she had known her husband was gone for some time but had not accepted it and felt she could not stay in town any longer. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 asked if they could talk after dinner, but her mother shook her head and said she wanted to leave as soon as possible. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 mentioned that 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 and Katsuki were on the porch if her mother wanted to say goodbye. Her mother brightened, said she did not have much time but would say her goodbyes, and followed 𝐻𝑖𝐿 out to the porch. Both boys perked up at their arrival. 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 stood and gave 𝐻𝑖𝐿 a shaky look before focusing on her mother. Her mother announced that she was leaving town and thought it would be nice to say goodbye to her favorite boy, then offered a respectful bow to Bakugou. Katsuki rose from his chair and, a little surprised, managed a quiet greeting. 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 offered for her to stay for dinner, but their mother shook her head again and declined, saying the train would leave soon and she did not want to be late. She added that it had been nice to see them and then walked down the driveway and out of sight. When she was gone, both 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 and Katsuki turned to 𝐻𝑖𝐿, searching for any sign of tears or distress, but they only found shock. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 cleared her throat, nervously smoothed her skirt, and asked if they were ready for dinner. When dinner was done and everyone had eaten their fill of pie, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 walked Katsuki to the door. 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 volunteered to stay behind and start the dishes so that she could see Katsuki off. As the doors closed, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 wrapped her arms around her shawl and hugged it tight against the cold. Katsuki stopped a few feet away and turned to look at her. After a few moments, he smiled. Katsuki thanked her for dinner and told her it had been lovely. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 returned his smile and told him she was glad he had come. They fell into a short, comfortable silence. Katsuki considered the state of their relationship what there was of it and felt the pressure of time. He knew he had to make a move or risk losing her, though he was unsure how to do it. Finally, he said he should be going and wished her a good evening with his usual teasing nickname. He walked down the stairs and out of sight, and 𝐻𝑖𝐿 released a shaky sigh. The cold drove her back inside after only a few moments, and before joining 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 in the kitchen she took a moment to light the fire in the parlor. The flames leapt to life and the room warmed quickly. She fought the urge to sit and read by the fire, promising herself she would later, and then went to finish the tidying. Most of the dishes were already cleared, and there was only a little food left to put away. As she wiped the counter, her thoughts drifted to the two boys who had filled her home that evening and to her mother. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 had not seen her mother dressed up in months. She had stopped wearing fancy skirts and blouses about a year ago when it became clear her husband was not coming home. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 had assumed her mother no longer kept makeup, but tonight proved otherwise. She worried about her mother's trip to the city. As far as 𝐻𝑖𝐿 knew, her mother and her aunt had not been in contact for years, perhaps not since before the war. Maybe they had been in touch, she thought. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 was away from home for several hours each day, which would give her mother plenty of time to write letters or make calls. If they were not speaking, however, she feared her mother might be reckless alone in the city. Without her father to steady her, there was no telling what her mother might do. All 𝐻𝑖𝐿 could do was hope her mother was not alone. When the kitchen was clean, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 took a bottle of wine and a bottle of whiskey from the pantry while 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 brought 2 glasses. They carried the drinks out to the front porch together. Empty beer bottles from Katsuki and 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇's earlier drinking remained on a step, but they ignored them and opened the bottles they had brought. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 poured a glass of wine for herself and handed 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 a glass of whiskey. She sat in the empty rocking chair beside him, took a long sip of wine, and let herself relax. They said nothing. They only sat, nursing their drinks and watching the last light slip from the sky. 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 thought about how surprisingly pleasant dinner had been and how sitting with Katsuki had not been as difficult as he had expected. He almost let himself hope they might have dinner together again, but he stopped the thought before it went further. As dusk deepened, neither of them could stay upright much longer. They rose, made their way to their respective rooms, and surrendered to sleep and the weight of the day. Over the course of that week, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 was showered in gifts and kind gestures from both boys. Katsuki brought dozens of bouquets of wildflowers, new skirts and blouses, and even a bottle of wine. He accompanied her to and from work most days, and during that time 𝐻𝑖𝐿 came to know him on a deeper level. 𝐰𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐂𝐇 provided home-cooked meals for every meal, some new books, a custom-made dresser for her room, and a new pair of boots. Beyond the presents, they had spent much-needed time together. Since he returned, 𝐰𝐿𝐶 had been focused on beating Bakugou at a game and had made up for lost time that week. They went on a couple of trail rides, had lunch together, and used their free hours to reconnect. All in all, it had been a good week and 𝑌N was ready for the weekend. After a long week of work and being pampered, she only wanted to rest. She gave her last student a farewell and quickly got to work, eager to get home for a warm meal and an evening on the porch. She moved through the motions of cleaning her classroom in a daze. It had been a blur. She blinked and then found herself shrugging on her shawl and locking the door. When the lock clicked, she realized Katsuki was nowhere to be seen. She spun on the porch steps and scanned the neighborhood for the blonde, but he was gone, and that worried her. In the time he had been courting her, he had never missed a chance to walk her home. Part of her wanted to wait, but she knew that if he was not there by now, the chances of him appearing were low. With a frown, 𝑌N descended the staircase slowly, taking one step at a time to give Bakugou extra time. She hugged her shawl closer and walked home, upset by Katsuki's absence. A frown carved itself into her face as she dragged her feet and left a faint trail of dust. She worried he might have decided there was no point in all of this, and the thought nearly made her tear up. Katsuki had become a constant in her life. She thought of him when she woke and before she slept. The walk to and from work had been something she looked forward to because of him. While she still did not know if he was the right man for her, she enjoyed his companionship deeply. Her gloomy thoughts were swept away when she saw 𝐰𝐿𝐶 standing at the foot of her porch with a bright, toothy grin. At the sight of his freckled face and cheerful expression, 𝑌N immediately brightened. She hurried over and put her arms around him, and 𝐰𝐿𝐶 wrapped his arms around her in return, swaying her gently as he said he had missed her and asked how work had been. 𝑌N closed her eyes and relaxed in his embrace before replying that it had been good and asking how his day had gone. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 told her his day had been okay and asked if she was ready for dinner. His face lit up at the mention of dinner, mischief dancing in his eyes, and 𝑌N felt her stomach growl. She laughed and told him she was ready, then asked what he had made. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 said it was a secret and urged her to wash up and grab warm clothes because he had something special planned. He took her hand and gently pulled her up the stairs, opened the door, and told her to go on inside, promising he would wait outside when she was finished. 𝑌N hesitated only a moment, then discarded her boots at the front door and hurried upstairs. In the bathroom she washed her hands and face, quickly freshening up. She changed out of her work clothes and into a long skirt and a long-sleeved blouse, added simple jewelry, and put her hair up so it was out of her face. After a few minutes she went downstairs and peeked outside the front door, finding 𝐰𝐿𝐶 gone. She took her time walking down the hall toward the back door, nervous about what might be waiting. When she opened the door she found a sweet scene. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 had moved a table into the backyard and arranged food on elegant dishes, with glasses and bottles of drinks set beside them. In the center of the table stood a tall vase of wildflowers, vibrant and fragrant. Behind the table the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of yellow, orange, and pink. It was a stunning backdrop. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 stood there, looking as dashing as ever in clean trousers and a plain white button-up with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. 𝑌N took him in, appreciating the effort he had made to create the perfect evening. No, his green hair was finally visible and 𝑌N could see the slightest bit of a curl. Overall, 𝑌N wanted to tell herself to forget the food. Her attention was on 𝐰𝐿𝐶 rather than the steak. Chapter 20, Brownies. 𝑌N admired the spread and asked 𝐰𝐿𝐶 how long it had taken him to set it up. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 flushed, clasped his hands behind his back, shrugged shyly, and asked whether she liked it. 𝑌N nodded and told him the food looked and smelled delicious, then complimented his appearance by telling him he looked handsome. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 turned an even deeper shade of red, smiled, and returned the compliment awkwardly, stumbling over his words. He quickly moved on, pulled out a chair for her, and invited her to sit, saying he bet she was hungry. 𝑌N hid her nervous smile and sat. As she began to get comfortable, 𝐰𝐿𝐶 hurried to push her chair in and patted her shoulder, assuring her that he had her. He asked what she would like to eat first and listed the meal he had prepared: chicken noodle soup with rolls, roasted beef and mashed potatoes, mixed vegetables, baked potatoes and yams, and bread. He admitted he had not made more because he did not want to overdo it. 𝐿 told him she was starving and to put whatever she thought best on her plate. She watched 𝐰𝐿𝐶 prepare her plate, telling him how much of each item she wanted. When he set the plate down and poured her a glass of wine, he waited until she was taken care of before preparing his own, which warmed her. Once he joined her, they paused for a moment before beginning. The food melted on 𝐿's tongue. The flavors were comforting and filling. Her manners slipped the moment the fork met her lips, and she sighed in delight as she ate. Between bites, she praised 𝐰𝐿𝐶 for his cooking and complimented him on the meal. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 soaked up her compliments and kind words, smiling and blushing throughout the meal. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 mentioned afterward that there was dessert and that he had made brownies, and that he had also brought fresh fruit from the market in case she was full. 𝐿 thanked him and asked for a brownie. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 eagerly placed a brownie on her plate and took one for himself, and they enjoyed the dessert together. Afterwards, 𝐰𝐿𝐶 told her to sit back and relax while he cleaned up the table. 𝐿 moved to the porch to stay out of his way and watched him carry the dishes inside. The backyard grew quiet as the sun sank between a dip in the mountains, the colors slowly fading. 𝐿 used the time to digest both the meal and her feelings. Tonight had felt like more than a dinner. There was a reason he had made all of her favorite foods. She suspected that after tonight, her single life might be changing. The thought excited her. She had longed for a family, a warm home, and someday children of her own, but it also made her nervous. She wondered if 𝐰𝐿𝐶 was the one who could give her everything she dreamed of. Her thoughts flicked to Bakugou and she felt the smile on her face falter. Over the last few weeks, she had grown to care deeply for both of them, and she worried about having to choose. Her thoughts were interrupted when 𝐰𝐿𝐶 walked through the open door with his hands hidden behind his back. He moved in a way that kept the object out of view until it made a small sound. 𝐿 set her glass aside and asked what he was hiding. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 revealed a small tricolored puppy with one ear standing tall, one ear folded, and a curly tail, a green ribbon tied around its neck like a gift. 𝐿 gasped and cupped her hands over her mouth as 𝐰𝐿𝐶 explained that a ranger had brought the puppy into town earlier and said he would otherwise be given away or put down. He said he had been looking for a suitable gift and the puppy had seemed to appear at the right time. He told her he had not named him and that she could choose a name if she wanted to keep him. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 carefully handed the puppy to 𝐿. She accepted him and ran her fingers through his wiry coat, tears welling in her eyes. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 said he had been thinking that, if she wanted to keep the puppy, he could be theirs. He then confessed that he really liked 𝐿, that he was done playing games, and that he wanted to come home knowing she was his. He said he wanted to give her everything she could possibly need and that he wanted to marry her. He acknowledged that Bakugou was also pursuing her and said he would understand if she chose him, but he believed he would be a better husband. Chapter 21. I Love You. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 confessed that they had been best friends for so long he knew 𝐿 like his own hand and that he loved her and would do anything to make her happy. A quiet pause followed while 𝐿 absorbed his words, her fingers moving through the puppy's soft fur. 𝐰𝐿𝐶 waited but could not hide his impatience. He knelt, took 𝐿's hands in his, and looked into her eyes as if begging for an answer. He told her he needed to hear her voice so he would know how to proceed. With a shaky breath, 𝐿 nodded and told him that she loved him too and was about to say more when 𝐰𝐿𝐶 leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her lips. The kiss was tender and full of emotion, a careful expression of feelings that had been building for years. 𝐿 responded, and for a moment they only held each other, learning this new closeness together. Their embrace deepened into a private, heartfelt moment rather than anything hurried. 𝐿 admitted that she needed him, and 𝐰𝐿𝐶 asked once more if she was sure. She confirmed with a quiet, certain nod. Instead of rushing forward, they allowed themselves to simply be near one another, sharing gentle touches and small, reassuring gestures. They moved together into the kitchen and continued to hold each other, kissing and laughing softly as if savoring the relief of finally being honest. Breathless and smiling, they took a moment to look each other over and acknowledge how much they had both changed since childhood. They had patched each other up and been there through awkward and difficult times, But this felt different 𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐿𝐵 in a way that was about trust and affection more than anything else. After a while, they stepped back with easy smiles and agreed to take things slowly, content to enjoy the warmth of the moment without hurrying. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 rolled her eyes playfully at Izuku's earnestness, and they both laughed, settling into the quiet happiness of having finally acknowledged what had been true for so long. She had never been more sure in her life. Somewhere deep down, she had always planned to choose Izuku over Bakugou. They had been best friends for so long that if it wasn't Izuku, it would not be anyone. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 trusted Izuku more than she trusted herself, and that made her certainty absolute. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 nodded confidently and told Izuku she was sure, then offered him an out if he needed more time. She said she would wait if he preferred. She gently removed her hands from his body. A chill ran down Izuku's spine at her offer. He was giving himself a chance to turn back and wait until they were officially married. Part of him wanted to wait, but a stronger, more insistent part urged him to commit now. If he committed, would it mean Bakugou could not come between them? Izuku cupped her face and kissed her gently. He told her he was sure, then suggested that his room down the hall might be more comfortable and private than the kitchen. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 did not care about the location, but she cared about him. She led him through the house because she did not want his first vulnerable moment to feel awkward or rushed. They climbed the stairs in a quiet, unspoken intimacy, neither of them speaking. At the doorway to her bedroom, 𝐻𝑖𝐿 gave him space to step inside and look around. Izuku took in the cozy room and felt a rush of fondness for how much of her it reflected. He sat on the edge of the bed and rested his hands at his sides. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 followed him slowly so as not to startle him. Everything about this was new for him, and she understood his nervousness. She let him take the lead, offering steady presence and calm. They shared a tender, nervous kiss and held each other close. Izuku tried to be careful and mindful. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 reassured him with her quiet confidence. Their closeness was gentle and emotionally charged rather than sketchy, and the moment allowed them to connect on a deeper level. They retreated into her room for privacy and spent the rest of the night together in a private, affectionate way that drew them closer and strengthened their trust. Later, Izuku looked at 𝐻𝑖𝐿 with awe and affection, overwhelmed by how much she meant to him and how lucky he felt. They communicated openly and with care, making sure they both felt safe and respected. The experience left them feeling more united and certain of the future they wanted to build together. After a moment, they shared a quiet, 𝐿𝑇𝐈𝐿 moment that left them both breathless. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 pulled back and, concerned by Izuku's sudden tears, asked if he was all right and removed her hands from him. It took him a moment to compose himself, then he smiled at her with an expression she had never seen before and told her she was wonderful, that he had never felt so cared for. He asked if he might show his gratitude in return. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 smiled and said she had something else in mind. They settled together on the bed in a gentle, tender embrace, holding each other close and exchanging quiet, heartfelt words. Izuku confessed how much he loved her, nearly in tears, and 𝐻𝑖𝐿 responded with a soft kiss and the same sentiment. They lingered in that comforting silence, interlaced fingers and steadying each other, before a sudden knock on the front door interrupted them. They froze and listened as the knocking grew louder and more insistent. The commotion drew a howl from the puppy in the backyard. Izuku offered to answer the door, but 𝐻𝑖𝐿 said she would go and that she would be right back. She dressed quickly, pulled on her skirt and a clean shirt without fussing with her hair, gave herself a brief look in the mirror, and hurried downstairs. Izuku remained on the bed, sinking back with a weary groan. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 wasn't sure who she expected to find when she opened the door. She had considered friends coming to drag her out for the night or perhaps her mother returning from worrying about the city life. Instead, Katsuki Bakugou stood on the doorstep with a large bouquet of wildflowers, looking dirty and windblown as if he had just come from a long day of work. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 reacted with surprise, and Katsuki took a shaky breath as he offered the flowers and apologized for not being able to walk her home, asking if she could forgive him. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 accepted the bouquet wordlessly, holding it to her chest. Katsuki reached out as if to pull her into a hug, but 𝐻𝑖𝐿 held up a hand, and his expression shifted when his eyes landed on a small, dark bruise at the base of her neck. 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 lowered her voice and began to explain that she and Izuku, but Katsuki abruptly cut her off, his muscles tensing and his tone hard as he told her not to finish the sentence. His jaw tightened and he turned his head to hide his teary eyes. 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 tried to say that she had to go, but Katsuki snapped that she should not call him by his name and accused her of leading him on, refusing to believe her. He spat that he could not believe her, then turned on his heel and stormed away. 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 watched with wide eyes as the blond man stomped down the porch steps, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. She stood there in shock and surprisingly in pain. She told herself that he was right, she had led him on, and the thought squeezed her heart. She may not have loved Katsuki, but he had meant something to her, and knowing she had caused him pain hurt. It hurt to think he would not walk her to school tomorrow. It took everything she had to keep from crying. She sniffled, shut and locked the doors quickly, and carried the bouquet into the kitchen. Katsuki may have just left her life, but she was not going to let his last gift go to waste. She filled a glass vase with water and set the flowers in the center of the kitchen table. Before heading back upstairs to Izuku, she opened the back door and looked for the gift Izuku had given her, the little fox terrier. To her surprise, the puppy was lying right by the door. Her heart softened at the sight. She picked up the little dog and brought him inside. 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 walked through the first floor, putting out candles and locking the windows. She finished sooner than she expected, then carried the puppy upstairs to her room and found Izuku fast asleep in her bed. The sight made her smile. He had been exhausted. She set the puppy down, closed the door quietly, and extinguished the remaining candles. She changed into sleepwear and lay down beside Izuku to sleep. While 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 was settling in, Katsuki rode through town with a deep frown etched on his face. He gripped the reins tightly with one hand and rested the other on his saddle horn, swaying with each step of the horse but not really noticing where he was going. He was lost in thought, wondering why 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 had chosen Izuku over him. Katsuki believed he was the better man. He knew he was not the nicest, but he thought he was strong and able to provide. Since returning from the war, he had taken his old job at the Todoroki ranch and worked day in and day out so he could save for his own place. He still lived with his parents and did not mind. Eventually he wanted a small ranch on the outskirts of town where he could raise cattle and start a family. The realization that the one girl he wanted did not want him back made his heart rattle in his chest. He tightened his grip on the reins and steered away from town instead of going home. He needed time alone to think, and he could not do that with his parents around. The farther he rode from town, the heavier the despair that settled in his chest. A weight pushed down on his sternum and his eyes watered. Against his will, a few tears leaked out and a sharp sound tore from his chest. He had never felt so devastated. During the war he had promised himself that if he survived he would finally man up and do what he could to be with 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒. For years he had pined for her, expressing his feelings in ways she often took as bullying. This crush had lasted a long time, and it hurt that someone else in town had managed to express their feelings better. Katsuki felt bitter and in pain. He believed 𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 had slipped through his fingers and that there was nothing he could do to fix it. He pulled his horse to a stop at the top of a small hill and looked down at a familiar river. Moonlight reflected off the water and lit the shoreline. He remembered playing in that stream with 𝐼𝐻𝑤𝑐𝑒 as children, throwing mud pies and hunting for salamanders. As they got older, the rough housing stopped and the river became the site of parties and memories. The river had watched him grow into the man he had become, and that memory made him smile faintly. After a moment he nudged the horse into a walk and began to head home, but they did not get far. A man stood in their path, wearing a three-piece suit and a startling smirk. Pale, with long black hair tied half up and half down, the stranger's features were illuminated by the moon. Katsuki did not recognize him and saw no horse or wagon nearby. He asked the man what he was doing out here and whether he was lost. The stranger chuckled in an English-accented voice and told Katsuki he was not lost. He addressed him by name and said he had a debt to collect and needed Katsuki's help. The floorboards squeaked beneath Katsuki's feet as he staggered through his family's house. He felt like he'd been hit by a train. Every inch of his body ached and begged him to stop. He managed a short, humorless snicker before focusing on reaching his room. He could not remember the night clearly. Fragments of faces and moments flashed across his mind without forming a whole. All he knew was a searing ache that left him hollowed out and exhausted. The clothes he wore when he collapsed were badly damaged, reduced to tattered fabric, and he frowned at them with dull confusion. He did not linger on the missing memories. He had a job to get to and duties that would not wait. He stripped away the ruined pieces, found simple replacements, a pair of denim pants and a plain button-down, and pulled on boots before settling a hat on his head. The house was quiet. It was early, his parents still slept. He closed the door softly behind him and dropped down the steps of the small front porch. The dirt crunched beneath his weight as he headed for the round pen to retrieve his horse. He had been sensible enough to untack the animal and turn him loose before collapsing the night before, and he was thankful for that. The ride to the ranch was longer than he liked, and he moved through the motions of tacking up with a slow, methodical rhythm. He checked the girth, slung the saddlebag over the saddle, and stowed a few necessities. With a grunt, he swung into the saddle and rode off toward the Todoroki estate. The Todoroki property sat on 70 acres 20 minutes outside of town. The family raised cattle, but their wealth came from long-standing fortunes. The herd was more tradition than profit. The estate was enclosed by fence, approached by a long dirt road that led to a 2-story house with 4 bedrooms and a barn just a few steps away. A round pen for staff and horses sat beside the barn. Fields, hills, and a stream let the cattle roam, and the place was the sort of home Katsuki could only dream of owning. Katsuki was one of 4 farmhands who kept the place running. His responsibilities centered on the horses and watching the cattle. By the time he returned and secured his mount in the pen, the sun had begun to rise, casting a pink glow over the land. Birds began to sing, and the cows shifted and mooed in the distance. The barn was long and wide, stalls lining the aisle. Of the 8 stalls, 6 were occupied by the Todoroki horses. Katsuki went to work with practiced efficiency, pulling shoes, trimming hooves, and fitting new ones. Time passed more quickly than his soreness would have allowed, and he finished the round of horses well before lunch. With spare time before mealtime, he moved to one of the carriages. He remembered Momo Yaoyorozu, a former classmate who would soon fill a prominent role in the household, having complained about the carriage feeling unsafe. That memory guided his hands as he tightened bolts and adjusted the axle until the wheel sat firm and true. The familiar ping of the triangle announced the start of the meal, and Katsuki nearly dropped his tools as he hurried toward the porch. Rei, the current head of the household, made a point of feeding the staff each day. She stood on the porch and called them in, offering simple sandwiches and a cup of water to replenish their energy. They bowed their heads in thanks and ate quickly. In less than 5 minutes their plates were empty and the hands were back to work. Patrol came next, a task Katsuki welcomed. He left the porch and practically hopped toward the round pen to tack up his horse, but stopped short when he noticed something missing. The saddle he had left on the fence was gone. It was a heavy 40-pound saddle. It could not simply vanish. Katsuki's eyebrows drew together and he scanned the property. The morning routine carried on around him, cows grazing, staff moving to their tasks, but the missing saddle tugged at the edges of his focus. He turned in a slow circle, searching for a sign, and felt the unsettled weight of one more small mystery to solve. Chapter 24. He was beyond confused, then suddenly everything clicked. That familiar fire flared inside Katsuki's chest. He could feel his veins heat and his heart pound against his sternum. He saw his saddle as clearly as day in the hands of one of his co-workers, a man with a habit of taking things and returning them broken. Katsuki tensed and his jaw locked. He told himself he was older now, no longer a mean little boy, no longer an a-hole, but the fire was fierce and burning. Katsuki called the man a rude name and, almost without thinking, strode over. He lunged and landed a sharp, decisive blow that sent the coworker staggering back in an exaggerated, animated burst of motion. 50-odd years ago, the people of Mighty River were given permission to live on the land. They could build a small settlement and raise cattle. They could settle down and start families as long as they paid their debt when the time came. Most of the original settlers had died and moved on, but a few remained. It was Katsuki's job to pay their debt. A few weeks later, the fire inside him had only grown worse. It was bigger and hotter, and Katsuki had nearly lost himself to it. He moved through his days resigned to the burning that he felt inside and to the knowledge that 𝐻𝑖𝑛 and Izuku would be married in 2 weeks. These were things he could not change. He worked and hoped the weight of it would eventually crush him. The fire overwhelmed him first. That night he did not go home after his shift. Instead he rode through town to 𝑌𝑛's house. As he began to rise up the driveway, the familiar Englishman appeared on the wind, snickering and calling him pathetic. Katsuki was too exhausted to fight the insult and, staring at the dark house where he imagined 𝑌𝑛 and Izuku together, he felt a cold, bitter knot in his stomach. He told himself he was pathetic. The Englishman proposed a new deal. He demanded that Katsuki kill the remaining original 5. 2 had already moved on and 3 remained. He made clear that once those were taken care of, Katsuki should kill the young man who now shared 𝑌𝑛's life. Then the Englishman urged him to use his fire and rode back into town. Katsuki stared at the house where his mentor Toshinori lived. He clenched his jaw and felt his fists ball. Fire. The Englishman had reminded him about throbbed through his veins. Part of him did not want to harm Toshinori, who had done nothing wrong and lived quietly on his land. Another part of him, fed by anger and loss, pushed him forward with the promise that completing this task would mean 𝑌𝑛 would be with him. That pole led him up the lane to Toshinori's small house. Toshinori no longer lived in the small jailhouse but in a modest home on the outskirts of town. He lived alone, refused help from anyone who was not a doctor, and kept no animals that required care. Katsuki told himself that no one would witness what he intended to do. He pushed open the front door and the Englishman's words echoed in his head. Use the fire. Inside the house was a single room. The old man lay asleep in the far corner with a rifle within reach of his bed. Katsuki felt the fire within him and let it ignite. Anger over losing 𝑌𝑛 and the sense of betrayal he carried fed the flames. Brilliant, otherworldly fire flared around him like a living cloak, lighting the room with a harsh, unnatural glow. His clothes darkened but did not burn, and his appearance became almost unrecognizable in that light. Toshinori stirred and sat up, reaching for his rifle with a puzzled frown. Katsuki moved to the curtains and the flames like the fabric with alarming speed, spreading to the wooden wall in a flash of light and heat. Toshinori watched in wide-eyed alarm as the room filled with fire. He shouted in confusion and fear. Katsuki stepped closer and said that he was collecting the debt. In the next instant, the house collapsed inward. When the sun rose over Mighty River, it came as a relief. The night before had hosted one of the most shocking series of killings in years. Several elders had died in fires overnight. Their homes had burned with them inside. Neighbors had heard and tried to respond, but they were too late. By sunrise the town was exhausted and grieving. Only those 3 houses had been touched, the rest of the settlement had been spared. The survivors were left to mourn the last of the founding people. Those who had helped fight the fires gathered at the most popular saloon to drink away their sorrow. Chapter 25. Grief. The loss hit the community hard. Everyone in town already knew about the arson and murders before the day had truly begun. As soon as 𝑌𝑛 and Izuku learned the news, they set out for the town hall. Dressed in their finest black, they rode into town in silence, grief heavy over their shoulders. Izuku took the news far harder than 𝑌𝑛. Toshinori had been his greatest role model growing up, and upon hearing of his death he fell apart, sobbing until he could barely stand. Toshinori had been like a father to Izuku, teaching him lessons as a boy and guiding him as he grew. Losing him felt like losing a parent. 𝑌𝑛 was devastated as well, but she held herself together enough to manage the wagon. Anger sharpened her grief. The elders had been the backbone of the community, its past and the beginning of its future, and they had been murdered and left in homes set aflame during the night. 𝑌𝑛 wanted their killer found and made to answer for what they had done. The town hall would be crowded that day. The mayor was hosting a gathering, and before the elders were buried, people could come to pay their respects. When 𝑌𝑛 and Izuku arrived, they were almost surprised to see the square filled with wagons and horses. It looked like the entire town had come. People clustered outside the hall and flowed into the building. Children ran and laughed, not yet understanding the weight of the day. 𝐰𝐸𝐿 managed to help 𝐲𝑖𝑛 from the wagon and led her inside, but the sight of 3 caskets at the front broke him down again. The town hall, usually a place for meetings and announcements with pews facing a single lectern, had been cleared of furniture. A table near the front door held baked goods and a photograph, and 3 wooden caskets stood at the head of the room. As they drew closer, they saw 3 black and white portraits of the deceased displayed above the caskets. 𝐰𝐸𝐿 was a trembling ruin, tears streaming down his face and his shoulders shaking. 𝐲𝑖𝑛 squeezed 𝐰𝐸𝐿's hand and guided him forward. The caskets were closed, but both knew Toshinori rested in one of them. A quiet ache rose in 𝐲𝑖𝑛, and she allowed herself to tear up. This was not the worst thing to ever strike Mighty River, but it would leave a stain on the town until the killer was found and brought to justice. 𝐲𝑖𝑛 narrowed her eyes and wondered who could have been cowardly enough to kill 3 elders in their homes and set those homes on fire during the night. Later, while the town grieved in its own way, 𝐲𝑖𝑛's friends gathered in her parlor, sharing a bottle of whiskey and chewing on biscuits while dinner quietly cooked in the kitchen. Around the dancing fire they traded memories of the 3 fallen elders. Toshinori was the most recognizable from the trio. He had played a big part in everyone's lives, teaching lessons and helping the town. Mirai Sasaki, the previous mayor, was less known to the crowd but respected for his service. David Shield had been the town's most trusted retired doctor. All 3 men had been leading figures in Mighty River. Momo Yaoyorozu spoke of learning under Sasaki's wing. Her family had long been involved in the town's government, and her mother had insisted she learn from first-hand accounts. Momo had spent much of her teenage years at the courthouse studying the law, and those were fond memories. Ochako recalled her time with David Shield. She had begun training to be a nurse around 13 and had worked at the hospital as an assistant for a few years. She could not be a doctor, but she had become a skilled nurse and had learned many practical lessons from Shield that she still applied in life. 𝐰𝐸𝐿 did not add much. Everyone knew how Toshinori had shaped his life. 𝐲𝑖𝑛 had come into his life later, but she too knew Toshinori had mattered to him. From the kitchen 𝐲𝑖𝑛 could hear their stories. She did not intrude. She had not grown up in the town and did not know the elders personally. She had, at most, exchanged kind gestures with them in passing. Instead of attending courtrooms or hospital wards, she poured her feelings into the meals she prepared. Chapter 26. Thank you. Katsuki chewed the inside of his cheek beneath his hat as the funeral procession moved slowly through town toward the graveyard. His brows furrowed and his jaw was locked. He felt terrible for what he had done, but the words "a stranger" had told him kept replaying in his head. The stranger had urged him to take violent revenge on the boy who was with the person Katsuki loved, and those words had etched themselves into his thoughts. He counted the minutes, a dangerous yearning tightening in his chest. When he glanced up he saw 𝐲𝑖𝑛 walking with 𝐰𝐸𝐿 and their friends, her arm threaded through 𝐰𝐸𝐿's. She seemed to be supporting him. 𝐰𝐸𝐿 looked hollow and fragile, and the sight of him set something bitter and sharp in Katsuki's gut. He forced that feeling down and focused only on 𝐲𝑖𝑛. Everyone else blurred into the background until she was the only thing he could see. She caught his eye and offered a brief, worn smile before the crowd swept her onward. Katsuki scoffed, turned, and went back into the bar. It was empty, as expected, so he helped himself to the whiskey behind the counter and drank without hesitation, letting the smoky warmth chase away the edge of the day. The funeral itself passed in a haze. 𝐲𝑖𝑛 was present but the details were blurry. 𝐰𝐸𝐿 had been inconsolable, his grief outward and endless until he simply ran out of tears. 𝐲𝑖𝑛 did not judge. She stayed by his side and offered what comfort she could. After the burial the mourners gathered at the church, where refreshments were provided to help people recover their strength. While she tended to 𝐰𝐸𝐿, 𝐲𝑖𝑛 also moved through the room, offering small consolations to others. Several townspeople offered 𝐲𝑖𝑛 and 𝐰𝐸𝐿 dinner, but she was unsure whether he would be able to eat. The walk home was quiet and slow. 𝐰𝐸𝐿 had stopped crying only because there were no tears left. He leaned on 𝐲𝑖𝑛 and depended on her to guide him. He was present in body but his mind had drifted into memory. At first he wandered through happier recollections of time spent with Toshinori, reliving days at the jailhouse and lessons learned and bonds formed. Those memories began warm, then shifted into anger as the reality returned. Someone had attacked Toshinori at home and set his house ablaze until it was destroyed. A coward had taken him, and Izuku's grief hardened into the need for justice. He vowed to find whoever was responsible and make them answer for what they had done. 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 called his name softly, prompting him to blink and come back to the foyer of their home. The light was waning. Their puppy sat at their feet, bright and expectant. 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 moved toward the kitchen and asked if he would like something to eat, noting that he had not really eaten all day. Izuku, still shaky, followed her and then wrapped his arms around her waist, leaning into her and resting his chin on her shoulder. He told her quietly that he was all right and thanked her for being there. They stood like that for a long time, and 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 did not pull away. It was the first time that day she had allowed herself to grieve as well, feeling that she had a place to mourn without judgment. It was then that everything hit her. She had not cried much since Izuku and the others returned, so the weight of her father's death descended on her like a train. Her mother's decision to leave for the city struck her without mercy, and Katsuki's sudden absence from her life compounded the pain. It all overwhelmed her so suddenly that she practically collapsed into Izuku's arms. If it had not been for his hands at her waist, she would have fallen to the floor. Sobs racked her body as tears streamed down her face. Izuku fought back his own tears and pulled 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 closer, turning her so she cried into his shoulder. He believed she was mourning Toshinori's passing, and he let that belief stand. They stayed like that in the kitchen until their breathing steadied and they finally pulled apart. Their swollen eyes met and Izuku gave a small, croaky smile as he offered to get them a drink. 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 managed a small smile and nodded, murmuring her agreement. After a quick clearing of his throat, Izuku told her to go change into something more comfortable while he prepared the drinks, joking that she should hurry before he drank all their wine. 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 rolled her eyes but could not suppress a small laugh. Reluctantly, she did as he asked. She had been wearing a stiff black dress for the last 5 hours and was ready to relax. A loose dress and a bottle of wine called to her. Chapter 27, Missing Katsuki. Weeks passed and the perpetrator behind the deadly attack on Mighty River's elders had yet to be found. The town authorities pursued leads, but each one ended in disappointment. Even after several weeks, the town remained in mourning. Most people returned to their routines, but a large portion of the community still felt the loss keenly. Izuku had been deeply affected by the events and, as a result, had not given 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 the attention she needed. Wedding planning sat on the back burner because he was not in the right headspace. Each morning while Izuku brooded in one part of the house, 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 walked to work alone. She spent her lunches by herself and walked home at the end of the day. She almost accepted it, but the loneliness remained. Izuku was a shadow of his former self. She did not mind postponing wedding plans, that was manageable. What concerned her were the daily chores that needed doing around the house. In the weeks since Toshinori's passing, she often came home to find tasks undone. Occasionally Izuku did something small, but not frequently enough to ease her burden. That morning was no different. 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 had risen earlier than usual to let the chickens out and turn the horses loose. She packed lunches for herself and Izuku, completed a few small tasks, and got ready. When she left, Izuku was still confined to his room. She could hear soft sniffles and knew he was awake, but by then she was too tired to wait. As the sun climbed, she walked down the lane. Sand and small stones crunched underfoot and the village was already awake. Cowboys stopped for breakfast before heading out, and some of the town's men stumbled from the bars and other late-night haunts. Passing the general store, she suddenly stopped when a certain blond man stepped out onto the porch. Their eyes met and 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 froze, her frown deepening. Katsuki stood very still, expression unreadable. When she had chosen Izuku, a decision she had thought logical, she had not wanted to lose Katsuki. She had enjoyed their time together and had hoped to remain friends, though she understood why he had departed. Something in the air shifted. Katsuki blinked and a storm of emotions washed over his face. Anger, grief, guilt, a flicker of relief, and other complex feelings. There was a fierce intensity in his gaze that made 𝐻𝑖𝐸𝑛 take a small step back. Before she could move away, Katsuki closed the distance between them. Katsuki greeted her in a gruff, familiar way and called her by an affectionate nickname. His gaze took her in before settling on her face as he asked if she was headed to work. 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 nodded and admitted she was running late. Katsuki mentioned he had a few minutes before he had to be at the ranch and offered to walk her to the schoolhouse. For reasons she could not fully explain, 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 did not refuse. The two used the walk to catch up, swapping stories and light teasing. 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 found she did not dislike the conversation. She had missed Katsuki more than she wanted to admit, and his company eased some of the loneliness. She learned he would be leaving soon on a cattle drive, which troubled her, but he reassured her that he would not go far and promised to bring a small memento back. When they reached the schoolhouse, their conversation dwindled. 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 paused at the bottom of the steps and turned back toward Katsuki, hesitating before asking if he would walk her home that day. Katsuki agreed with a humming affirmation and reminded her to get to work so she would not be late. She suppressed a laugh and climbed the stairs, giving him a final smile before entering the classroom. Because the walk had taken longer than she expected, 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 had little time to prepare. She pushed thoughts of Katsuki into the far corner of her mind and set to work, sweeping dust from the floor, wiping down desks, and arranging books. Children began to file in, calling greeting after greeting and dropping apples on her desk. She responded to each child with a warm smile and returned their greetings, settling into the familiar rhythm of her day. While they waited for the bell, the students gathered in small groups to talk with one another. When the clock tower rang, signaling the start of the day, the children quickly took their seats. 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 spent a few extra minutes preparing her lessons, then turned to face her class as they buzzed with anticipation. She clapped her hands and picked up a small book from her desk, indicating that the lesson was beginning. 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 tried to focus on her teaching, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Katsuki. She found herself wondering whether she had made the right choice and whether Katsuki might have been a better partner in the long run. She loved Izuku and looked forward to a life with him, but a persistent part of her could not help the questions that surfaced. When lunchtime arrived, she welcomed the break. Rather than going outside as she usually did, she stayed at her desk to finish lesson planning, enjoying the relative quiet while her students played outdoors. Their laughter drifted in through the open windows and door, keeping the schoolhouse feeling alive. Not long into her break, she heard the creak of the schoolhouse stairs and a knock at the door. Looking up from her plans, she found Katsuki standing there. She brightened noticeably at the surprise of his visit. He stepped inside, and she noticed he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers and a little cotton sack. He indicated that he wanted to join her for lunch. They stayed inside and decided to dine at her desk. Katsuki pulled a chair up and helped clear a space while 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 opened a few windows. Once the windows were raised, the children's laughter filled the room. Normally that noise might have irritated him, but today he seemed content to hear it. Katsuki was not entirely sure why he had come. Part of him thought it impulsive, yet he kept going and rode down to join her. He was glad he had made that choice. It felt good simply to be near her, to share conversation and laughter. For 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛, lunch with Katsuki was more than a social visit from an old suitor. For the first time in weeks, she had someone who listened to her stories about work and showed interest. It felt good to talk with him. When the bell signaled the next hour, Katsuki rose and began tidying the desk. 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 protested and tried to take over the cleaning, nearly pushing him aside, but he ignored her and finished anyway. She thanked him, admitting quietly that it had been nice. He returned her gratitude with a grin and a firm nod, making it clear he would return to the ranch but planned to see her again. She agreed with a smile. They left together, navigating a horde of playful children, and reached his horse without incident. She watched him mount, adjust himself in the saddle, and ride off without looking back. She felt a slight relief at that and turned back toward the schoolhouse, wiping her palms on her skirt. Back inside, her students awaited her with curious faces. They asked whether she was going to marry Mr. Bakugou, what about Mr. Izuku, and what she and Mr. Bakugou had been talking about. 𝐻𝑤𝑖𝑛 explained that there was nothing more than lunch and redirected them to focus on their lessons, shutting down their insistent curiosity. When the final bell rang, she nearly fell to her knees in gratitude. The children packed up quickly and streamed out the door, each offering a smile and a quick word of thanks. Once outside, they reverted to their usual energetic chaos, running, shouting, and tossing their books in playful disorder. 𝐻𝑚 watched them go, relieved that her responsibilities for the day were done. Shortly after the bell, the classroom was empty and she stood alone, thankful for the quiet. She cleaned up the schoolhouse in silence and prepared things for the following morning. She had just begun teaching her students how to write in cursive and planned to start reading cursive the next day. Digging through crates of old books and letters for material, she was in the middle of tidying the closet when the wooden floorboards creaked. She would have ignored it if not for the low whistle that followed. 𝐻𝑚 sat back on her haunches and turned to see who had entered the room, and she was not surprised to find Katsuki standing there. Katsuki greeted her with a playful, mock salute and tipped his hat, offering his help. 𝐻𝑚 fought back a smile. As she rose, wiping sweat from her brow and smoothing her skirts, she cast an appreciative glance at the ranch hand. He had just finished work and was dustied from labor, but she still found his presence appealing. 𝐻𝑚 thanked him for the offer and explained that the crates were heavy and giving her trouble. Katsuki returned her mischievous smirk, rolled his eyes, and moved to help. He set down a small bouquet of wildflowers and carefully lifted the crates of books and texts, stacking them so they would not topple and putting things away where he thought they belonged. He handled the job with an unexpectedly gentle touch. Catching sight of the darkening sky through the window, 𝐻𝑚 cleared her throat and said it was getting late and she needed to be home to prepare supper. Katsuki's smile faded into a small frown she could not see from behind him. That single reminder of her other life had shifted his mood. For a little while that day, Katsuki had forgotten that 𝐻𝑚 planned to marry Izuku and had simply enjoyed her company. The reminder changed everything. He straightened, turned to face her, and pushed for honesty. Katsuki asked whether Izuku treated her well and whether choosing him had been worth it. The questions were blunt, born from the pain of watching someone he cared about choose another. 𝐻𝑚 struggled to find the words as tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. Katsuki told her he only wanted the truth, and 𝐻𝑚 said she had to go. She muttered that she needed to leave and quickly exited the building, leaving the bouquet on the desk. Katsuki felt disappointed but not surprised. He sighed, brushed dust from his hands, and walked away from the schoolhouse. As the sun set behind him and sweat soaked his shirt, he grew bitter thinking about the flowers he had left behind. They would be wilted by morning, but in that moment he could not bring himself to care. 𝐻𝑚 steps through the threshold and into the quiet house, pausing after the door shuts behind her. She cannot hear a single thing, not the squeaking of the floorboards nor the gut-wrenching sobbing she has grown accustomed to. Gulping, she brushes off that sense of familiarity and starts to take off her boots, setting them under the bench and hanging up her shawl. Slowly she moves through the house, uncertainty settling in the pits of her stomach. 𝐻𝑚 calls for Izuku, her voice echoing. The familiar pitter-patter of paws answers. Their puppy emerges from the parlor, little and yappy but delighted to see her. 𝐻𝑚 greets the puppy softly, bending to scoop him up into her arms. He covers her face with enthusiastic licks, and she giggles, then asks where Izuku is. The puppy wiggles free, drops to the floor, and darts toward the kitchen. 𝐻𝑚 follows the puppy into the kitchen and finds him pawing at the back door. She opens it, and the puppy bolts outside. She steps onto the porch and freezes when she sees a hunched figure seated at the edge. Izuku sits on the porch with a thin blanket over his shoulders. His hair has grown out into a ruffled mess, and the skin that shows is pale. His form looks smaller from lack of nutrition. He has not been eating much lately. 𝐻𝑚 steps closer and asks if he is okay. She notes that she has not seen him outside of bed in days. He has been holed up in his room with the door shut and the curtains drawn. Seeing him now is a shock. She swallows hard when he does not answer and sits beside him. For a long moment they sit without speaking, watching the puppy play with the chickens. Eventually Izuku tells her that she deserves better and apologizes, his voice deep and raspy and sounding on the verge of tears. 𝐻𝑚 moves in closer, rests a hand on his shoulder, and leans into his side, reminding him that he is grieving. He hums in response but does not agree aloud. She does not press him, and after a while she rises and says she will start on supper before heading inside. The rest of the evening is quiet. 𝐻𝑚 cooks while Izuku sits outside with the puppy. They do not speak. When she brings him a plate, he murmurs a small thank you and that is all. The night is spent apart, each of them grieving in their own way. 𝑌𝑁 feels for Izuku. Toshinori was a large part of his life and now he is gone, his killer's still at large. Izuku may take as long as he needs to grieve, and 𝑌𝑁 will remain by his side. She wonders whether things would be different if they were married. She glances at her ring finger, flexing it beneath the light, and decides that nothing would change, ring or not, she will stay. She watches the puppy and repeats to herself the vow through sickness and in health, reaffirming her commitment. Chapter 30. The L house is dark. It is well past 2 in the morning and everyone is asleep. No one notices when the front door closes softly and the old floorboards creak. Only the puppy stirs, jumping up to investigate the newcomer, sniffing boots and pawing at denim before the stranger gently shoos him away and continues down the hall. The stranger moves carefully, turning toward a bright white door that seems to hold the source of his pain. He pauses to listen for any sound in the house beyond the puppy's footsteps. The coast appears clear. Floorboards creak under his weight as he approaches the door. He places his hand on the knob, turns it, and opens the dark room. Inside he can make out a lump lying in the bed pushed into the far corner. His boots suddenly feel heavy, sweat beads on his forehead, and his heart races. He had come with a single purpose, but guilt wells up before he has acted. He watches the figure breathe, feeling like a sinner in a quiet church. He glances back down the hall, then steels himself and takes cautious steps toward the bed. His fingers curl into fists and his nails press into his palms. He stops at the edge of the bed and studies the peaceful sleeper, who snores softly beneath the covers. The stranger hesitates, knowing that if he completes what he came to do, there will be no turning back. And if he did this, it could backfire heavily. For a heartbeat he allowed himself to imagine it might not, that everything would fall into place the way he hoped, and that thought was enough. He straightened his back, cleared his throat, and walked away from the bed toward the windows. When his hand brushed the curtains, they ignited in an instant. The curtains burst into bright orange ribbons of flame that danced and spread with uncanny speed, climbing the wall and racing along the room as if alive. He stepped back to watch the blaze transform the space into a glowing stage, flames chasing the wallpaper and reaching for the wooden furniture. The room warmed and brightened until he no longer needed to squint. After a long look, he turned and left, closing the door behind him. He considered locking the door, then decided instead to leave it slightly secured, a small mercy for whoever might wake there. He touched the wall absent-mindedly and the wallpaper flared where his fingers had been. The fire took hold, and soon the hallway was a corridor of living. As he moved through the house toward the backyard, he nudged other things into flames so the fire would spread. At first he had intended to set only one room alight, but something in him urged it further. He stepped out onto the creaking porch and descended into the yard, pausing at a safe distance to watch. A small pang hit him as the house glowed from within. He had once admired the architecture, now he was the one watching it burn. He frowned at himself and made a quiet promise to rebuild it. He would rebuild it just for her. Chapter 31. Fire. 𝑌𝑁 sat up in bed and rubbed her eyes, noticing at first only how unusually warm the room felt. When her vision cleared, she saw a flickering light at the doorframe and wondered aloud why it was so warm. She slid to the end of the bed to put on her slippers and stood up, still half-dazed. She went to the door and pulled the knob, then stumbled back with a gasp when she saw the hallway filled with fire. Flames climbed the walls and licked at the staircase. The roar of burning wood and the creak of strained beams filled her ears as smoke pooled heavy in the air, making each breath a struggle. For a moment she froze, stunned and terrified, certain she was trapped. Then she remembered she had not been living alone for months and called out for Izuku. Flames at her ankles stopped her from moving. She slammed her door shut and staggered to the window, fumbling with it until a small breeze finally drew some smoke out of the room. She bent over coughing and searched the street for help. In the distance she could see people and horses racing up the hill. She shouted for help. Peering down, she realized the height made any jump impossible. She would have to wait for rescue. The sheriff was visible coordinating the crowd, assigning people to sections of the house. Neighbors passed buckets of water and rushed toward the blaze. The sheriff called up that people were on their way and urged her to stay where she was. Overcome with emotion, she feared for Izuku and their dog and for the house her parents had built. She cried for the possibility that she might not make it out, and for everyone she loved who might be trapped inside. Shouts blended into the crackling of the flames until a loud crash from within the house signaled a collapsing floor. She moved closer to the door and saw a gaping hole down the hall and then cried even harder. Smoke filled her lungs with each breath. She doubled over in violent coughing, covered her mouth with trembling hands, and ducked back from the window to draw in as much clean air as she could. Katsuki leapt down from his horse and ran toward her window, calling her name urgently and asking if she was okay and if she was hurt. 𝑌𝑁 lifted her head, feeling an intense relief at his arrival, and nodded that she was all right, though she tried to explain her fears. Katsuki told her not to move and ran for the front door. She watched him force his way past the crowd on the porch and push through the throng of rescuers. People crowded the lawn, some filling buckets at the well, others running them toward the house to fight the fire. A few lay on the grass catching their breath, coughing from the smoke. Neighbors kept onlookers back, mostly women and children who watched in worried silence. Beyond them, the horses in the stable panicked, rearing and pacing as the night flared bright. 𝑌𝑁 stepped away from the window to assess her situation and wait for help to reach her. She wiped at her eyes and dabbed at her nose. Flames were starting to eat at the walls and furniture. The room was no longer dark, everything stood out with unsettling clarity. She had only a few minutes before the fire became truly dangerous. With that in mind, she forced herself to move toward the closet, searching through smoke for a coat or anything to cover herself more. In the short time it took her to act, the fire spread. She avoided looking at it and found her way, coughing through the smoke, to the bedside table where a framed photo of her and her parents sat. If nothing else survived, she wanted at least that. A loud creak pulled her attention to the door. She turned and found a broad figure filling the doorway. Coughing from inhaled smoke, she struggled to breathe. Katsuki moved quickly, bending and lifting her into his arms, one hand under her legs and the other steadying her back. He told her not to look and offered a comforting gesture at the top of her head. She buried her face against his chest and clutched the picture frame to her stomach as he covered them both with her coat and carried her through the house. The house that had been full of laughter and memories was collapsing in an anxious, cinematic blur. Ceilings sagged, walls buckled, and furniture was reduced to blackened forms. Katsuki hurried them down the stairs and toward the door, fighting the urge to look back down the hall. He pushed past people trying to fight the flames, determined to get her out. Outside, the mob and emergency responders moved with urgency. The sheriff was at the front door directing people out of the house and making note of who was present and alive. Katsuki's focus never wavered from 𝑌𝑁. Her face and hair were streaked with soot, and she sat in a daze, staring at the remains of the house without registering the danger. The structure began to creak and fail where she stood. People in the crowd gasped, and some could not look away as the house continued to settle into ruin. Katsuki eased 𝑌𝑁 down in front of the well and did his best to tend to her, knowing she was physically unhurt but trying to soothe the shock inside her. As the scene quieted and people started to disperse, the fire dying down, 𝑌𝑁 blinked and found herself sitting in Katsuki's arms. Seeing the remains of her home washed over her, and she broke down into sobs. Katsuki gathered her close, murmured reassurances, and rested his forehead against hers in a quiet attempt to calm her. She did not believe him. Chapter 32, Weakness. By morning, the whole town knew the pretty house on the hill had burned. Everyone knew 𝑌𝑁 had barely escaped and that Izuku had been lost in the flames. 𝑌𝑁 herself had not yet fully absorbed all of it. After the doctor cleared her, Katsuki brought her to his home. With her house gone, she had nowhere else to go. She remained silent through the ride, swaying with the horse as Katsuki sat behind her, his arms keeping her steady. He said nothing because he did not know what to say. When they arrived and endured Bakugou's probing questions, 𝑌𝑁 finally rested. The next morning she woke to the smell of breakfast and an instinctive thought of Izuku preparing it. She sat up slowly and realized she was not in her own bed or room. Flashbacks of the fire returned, collapsing timber, smoke filling the air, the sensation of fear closing in. The bedroom door opened and Mitsuki entered, offering a tentative smile as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Mitsuki asked after how 𝐻𝑖𝐿 was feeling with a soft voice. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 answered that she was okay and then asked about the house and whether everyone had gotten out. Mitsuki's expression shifted into pity. After a moment of fidgeting, Mitsuki delivered the painful news that Izuku's body had not been recovered, choosing her words with care and struggling not to be overwhelmed herself. The hope 𝐻𝑖𝐿 had cultivated over the past 2 years, hope for a life with Izuku, crumbled at that announcement. She collapsed inward, grief ripping through her like a physical force, and tears began to pour from her eyes. Mitsuki was at a loss. She was not an emotional woman by nature, and her husband, Masaru, tended to be the one to comfort others. Mitsuki considered briefly going to find him. Chapter 33. You are welcome. After some careful thought, she sat beside 𝐻𝑖𝐿 and pulled her into a tight hug. Days passed and the Bakugou family watched in horror and pity as 𝐻𝑖𝐿 became a shell of a person. She spent days sitting on Katsuki's bed with dried tears staining her cheeks and his pillows. She did not eat or speak. She had no tears left, and she lay there with thoughts and regrets swarming her mind. Izuku was gone. His funeral had been 2 days earlier and she had missed it. He had been laid to rest at the church alongside his parents. Katsuki had said that it had been a nice ceremony. Her family's home was in ruins. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 knew logically it was not her fault, but she could not help wondering if Izuku would still be alive if she had acted differently. She wondered if the house her father had built would still be standing if she had done something else. It was hard not to blame herself when she was the only survivor. The Bakugou house was empty when 𝐻𝑖𝐿 finally sat up. It was around noon and everyone was at work. Something in her had changed and she decided to get up. It must have been because her sides were sore or because she could not go much longer without food. That feeling made her swing her feet over Katsuki's bed and place them on the floor. Her bones trembled as she sat up and took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room. Katsuki had a small room in his parents' house that suited him. There were dirty rugs on the floor, boots strewn about, and a pile of dirty clothes in the corner. His window was open, letting in a breeze that 𝐻𝑖𝐿 welcomed. An old western saddle rested atop a worn blanket in the corner, propped on a stool. Just below the saddle sat a stack of books with a thin layer of dust on their cloth covers. Katsuki was a mess, but intelligent, and that showed in his room. 𝐻𝑖𝐿 took a minute to find the strength to stand, and when she did it felt as though she had not moved in decades. That sensation made her fall to the ground. She did not try to move. She barely breathed. She lay there, wanting to cry but too weak to summon tears. The sun was beginning to set when Katsuki saw the shape of his humble home on the horizon. The vibrant colors in the sky painted the prettiest picture he had ever seen, but he was too occupied to appreciate the beauty. He had known his actions would have consequences and that 𝐻𝑖𝐿 would not take them easily, but he had not been prepared for the bout of depression that followed. It had been days since he had heard a whisper from her. She had stopped crying 2 days earlier when he told her about Izuku's funeral. She had neither cried nor spoken since. She had been quiet. His mother had told him that people grieved differently. He was aware of that, he had fought in the war, after all, but this was different. Katsuki dismounted his horse with a groan, went through the motions of untacking and grooming, and then turned the animal out in the pasture. He put his gear away in the small barn on his parents' property and then headed inside. The house was quiet, which was not unusual these days. His parents had been staying in town longer to avoid coming back. It felt depressing and they did not want to be around unless necessary. He had adopted a new routine. Instead of going straight to his room, he took the time to start supper. His father had taught him a few things, and he had grown to enjoy the act. It was something he took pride in. He lit a few candles and prepared a warm meal of biscuits, gravy, and coffee. It took no more than half an hour. He was lost in thought when the floorboards creaked. His heart stopped for a second. It stuttered. For a moment he feared someone was in the house, feared for his life, and then he remembered there was someone else living there. He turned and saw 𝐻𝑖𝐿 leaning against the wall. They stared at each other across the table. Their dinner sat plated in front of them, nearly cold and untouched. Neither of them spoke. They simply sat and looked at one another. Katsuki was too taken by her presence to do anything else. 𝐻𝑤𝑐, exhausted and weak, could not find the energy to speak. She felt his observant eyes scan her features and knew she looked awful. Her cheeks had sunken, her skin was pale, her hair was greasier than usual, and she could feel blemishes starting to form along her chin. She was thinner. The floral skirts and pretty blouses were gone. After a few quiet moments, Katsuki cleared his throat, shifted his position, and asked if she was thirsty, glancing at the pitcher of water in the center of the table. He mentioned that his mother might have wine or whiskey hidden somewhere if she did not want water. 𝐻𝑤𝑐 blinked and opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. After a moment she rasped that she would have water, clearing her throat and wincing at the action. Katsuki quickly poured a cup of water and set it before her, then sat with a tentative, loose smile. He whispered that he had missed walking her to school and that he had missed her. She took the cool water gratefully, letting it soothe her throat. The relief reminded her that she had a job, and she asked after her children, wanting to know if they were all right. Katsuki nodded, humming his agreement, and said that they were fine. He explained that Aizawa had been working with them and that they should be okay if she took a few more days. Conversation dwindled and they focused on eating in silence. The quiet did not last long. The sound of a wagon pulling up and gravel crunching under wooden wheels reached their ears, followed by shouting. Through the window, they saw Mitsuki and Masaru walking up the path and laughing together. The sound of genuine laughter made 𝐻𝑤𝑐 raise her brows. She had not heard anything like it in weeks. But as soon as Mitsuki and Masaru saw 𝐻𝑤𝑐, their laughter faded. Mitsuki dropped what she was carrying and pulled 𝐻𝑤𝑐 into a stiff embrace, patting her back before stepping back to look her over and frowning. Mitsuki asked if she had been getting much sleep. 𝐻𝑤𝑐 managed a small smile and said she was okay and had slept a little. She thanked them for their generosity and added that she did not mean to overstay her welcome. Masaru protested that she had always been welcome and told her she could stay as long as she needed. 𝐻𝑤𝑐 looked at every Bakugou in the room and returned a smile, her eyes rimmed with moisture.